They told you it's normal, that self-criticism keeps you sharp, that the voice in your head must be tough, stern, unforgiving. But if that were true, why do so many people feel drained, heavy, exhausted from their own thoughts? Why do you feel weighed down by inner pressure, stuck in cycles of guilt, shame, and silent blame that no one else ever hears? The truth is this: your inner voice shapes your world. Every thought is a seed. Every word you whisper to yourself becomes part of your future. And Buddhism has known this for thousands of years. The great teachers didn't find peace by force or self-punishment. They found it through gentle strength, through compassion, through the simple but powerful truth that the mind blossoms when spoken to with kindness, not cruelty. Tonight, as you listen, something will soften inside you. The noise in your head will slow down. The tension you've been carrying in your chest will start to loosen. You'll feel a warmth, a quiet shift, like a lantern being lit in a dark room. And when you wake up tomorrow, something will be different. Your thoughts will feel lighter. Your heart will feel safer. And for the first time in a long time, you'll feel like you're finally on your own side. This is not just another message. This is a doorway, a return to gentleness, a return to truth, a return to the version of you that has always deserved kindness, compassion, and inner peace. Are you ready? Let's begin. The moment you begin treating yourself with kindness, the whole inner world shifts. The tone of your thoughts changes, your breath loosens, and something inside you finally feels safe enough to open. That's where the real work begins, because the voice you speak to yourself with doesn't stay trapped in the present moment. It echoes forward. It shapes your mood, your reactions, your choices, and the future version of you. Buddhism goes deeper than simple advice. It shows that your inner voice becomes the architecture of your life. It teaches that inner speech is not harmless background noise, but a cause that generates effects. And now the truth unfolds, quietly but powerfully, so you finally understand the influence you carry within your own mind. There is a truth that hits in a way you feel more than understand. The way you speak to yourself becomes the way you experience the world. Not because anything magical happens, but because every thought sets a direction for the next one. A single harsh sentence whispered inside you can trigger a chain of emotions that cling to you for hours, days, or even years. People think their mood drops randomly, but very often the shift started earlier with one small inner comment they didn't notice. Buddhism calls these impressions seeds, and seeds never stay seeds. They grow. A thought repeated becomes a habit repeated becomes a state carried long enough becomes the lens through which you live. This is why inner dialogue matters more than people think. Thoughts feel private, quiet, harmless. But what's quiet is often the most powerful. What happens inside becomes the blueprint for what you feel in your body, how you react under stress, how you treat the people around you, and whether you move through life with heaviness or calmness. Harsh self-talk creates a kind of weather inside you, a mood climate that lingers long after the thought ends. If you tell yourself you're not good enough, that one moment doesn't end when the sentence ends. It tightens your chest, it stiffens your breath, it pulls your shoulders inward. Your nervous system responds as if an enemy is nearby. Except the enemy is the voice inside you. This is the karma of inner dialogue. Harmful thoughts create harmful states. Kind thoughts create peaceful states. Many people walk through life suffering not because the world is hurting them, but because their own inner voice is draining them. When you insult yourself in your own mind, your body reacts the same way it reacts when someone else insults you. It releases stress chemicals, it enters defense mode, it becomes tense and alert. People think they are overthinking, but many times they are actually reacting to the tone of their own mind. The mind is obedient. It follows the voice you repeat. If the voice is harsh, the mind becomes fearful. If the voice is gentle, the mind becomes stable. What you practice internally becomes the reality you feel externally. Awareness becomes important not to silence the mind or reach perfection, but to stop planting harmful seeds before they turn into emotional storms. A small, unnoticed criticism can shift the way an entire day feels. You can be surrounded by things that should bring joy, yet feel nothing, because the inner voice blocks the connection. A single act of inner kindness can soften the whole day. The outside world doesn't shift, but your inner world does, and that inner shift becomes the difference between peace and suffering. Negative inner speech spreads faster than most people realize. If you tell yourself you always fail, your mind doesn't treat it as a passing opinion. It treats it as a truth. Once that truth lands, the mind begins looking for evidence. Every mistake becomes bigger. Every weakness becomes heavier. The world starts to look darker than it is. This is the karma of inner dialogue, the emotional future built from the thoughts of the present. The mind doesn't only react to inner speech, it begins to expect it. If harshness is constant, the mind becomes conditioned to scan for threats. It starts looking for flaws before possibilities. It holds tension even when nothing is wrong. This is how future suffering forms, not because the future is painful, but because the mind has been trained to brace for impact. Many people believe their future will be difficult, but often the difficulty comes from the voice they have repeated for years, not from life itself. In Buddhism, the state of your next moment depends on the state of this one. Every thought is a stepping stone. A harsh step leads to another harsh step. A gentle step leads to a calmer one. If you speak to yourself with cruelty, the next moment naturally becomes heavier. This is how suffering spreads, not through fate, not through punishment, but through habit. Harsh self-talk also creates an identity. If you tell yourself repeatedly that you're weak, the mind adopts that identity and behaves from it. If you tell yourself that you're unworthy, neutral moments begin to feel like rejection. If you tell yourself that you will fail, the mind prepares to collapse even before you begin anything. This is not superstition. It is the mind following the pattern you gave it. Inner criticism triggers emotional states that create more suffering later. A harsh sentence plants shame. Shame creates withdrawal. Withdrawal brings loneliness. Loneliness fuels more harsh sentences. The cycle deepens until it feels like truth instead of habit. People carry this pattern for decades, unaware that the first spark came from how they spoke to themselves during a vulnerable moment. Buddhism teaches that no one can hurt you more than the mind when it turns against itself. The subtle danger is that people often disguise harshness as practicality. They think they must be hard on themselves to stay disciplined. They believe kindness makes them weak, but harshness doesn't produce strength. It produces fear, and fear blocks clarity, creativity, confidence, and wisdom. A compassionate inner voice doesn't let you avoid responsibility. It allows you to face responsibility without collapsing. It turns growth into something sustainable. It turns mistakes into lessons instead of wounds. The mind becomes what it practices. If you practice internal hostility, the mind becomes rigid. If you practice internal gentleness, the mind becomes open. An open mind handles stress better than a fearful one. This is why the karma of inner dialogue shapes not only how you feel in this moment, but how well you will handle challenges tomorrow. Your patience, your perspective, your resilience, your emotional steadiness, all of them begin with the tone you use on yourself. For many people, the inner critic isn't even their true voice. It is something they inherited: a parent's tone, a teacher's judgment, a past humiliation, a set of expectations they didn't choose. But when that voice repeats inside you, the mind treats it as your own identity. If you don't question it, it becomes the center of your self-perception. That perception shapes actions. Those actions shape consequences. And this is how karmic seeds become karmic patterns. The moment you soften your inner speech, the chain breaks. A different seed falls. A different future opens. A gentle thought creates safety. Safety creates clarity. Clarity creates wise action. Wise action creates calm results. The world doesn't magically change, but your relationship with it does, and that small change can reshape everything that comes after it. The way you speak to yourself becomes the atmosphere you live in, and once you see how deeply that inner speech shapes your future, something inside starts paying attention in a new way. You begin to notice the tone behind your thoughts. You begin to sense which sentences lift you and which ones trap you. That awareness naturally opens the door to something deeper, something Buddhism has taught for centuries. The same rules you apply to how you speak to others must be applied to how you speak to yourself. The path doesn't split between inner and outer. The mind doesn't recognize that kind of divide. It receives every word you speak, whether spoken out loud or spoken silently in the depths of your own awareness. And now we enter that truth with even more clarity. There is a moment when you realize that the speech within you is not background noise, but active creation. It shapes emotion, behavior, decisions, and the quality of your days. Buddhism calls this right speech, but most people interpret it only as external kindness. No lying, no harming, no gossip, no cruelty. Yet the inner world is built by the same principles. The tone you use inside must follow the same path, because the mind responds to internal words with the same sensitivity it responds to external ones. The body doesn't distinguish whether the wound came from another person or from yourself. Harm is harm. Care is care. And this is where inner right speech begins. Right speech turned inward means noticing the subtle aggression hidden in your thoughts. It means noticing those quiet moments when you call yourself names you would never dare to use on another human being. It means noticing how often you replay old mistakes as if you are punishing yourself again and again for something that already ended long ago. The mind receives those moments as fresh cuts. It feels the sting even when the words are silent. And this is the exact opposite of the Buddhist path, because right speech is not simply about being polite. It is about creating a mental environment that reduces suffering rather than multiplies it. Inner right speech is the practice of speaking to yourself as if your inner life matters, not as a luxury, not as something optional, but as something that shapes the foundation of every future thought. When you speak to yourself with harshness, the mind becomes fearful and reactive. When you speak with gentleness, the mind becomes open and steady. This shift is not a theory. It is the lived experience of anyone who has ever softened their internal tone and watched their whole day unfold differently. Many people try to follow the eightfold path in their relationships, their work, their communication with the world. They focus on being honest, being kind, avoiding harm, but they forget that their first relationship is with themselves. If right speech creates harmony in the outer world, then inner right speech creates harmony in the inner world. And when the inner world is chaotic, the outer world becomes harder, even if nothing external has changed. This is why Buddhism insists that the mind is the root of all experience. What you cultivate inside you determines how you perceive everything outside you. Right speech applied inward begins with honesty, not brutal honesty, not insulting honesty, but honest awareness. You tell yourself the truth without tearing yourself apart. You acknowledge your weaknesses without labeling yourself as weak. You acknowledge mistakes without turning them into self-punishment. This kind of honesty becomes a powerful form of alignment. When you stop lying to yourself about who you are or pretending to be something you're not, the mind stops fighting itself. It relaxes. It becomes grounded. This is the first stage of inner right speech, truthful but not harmful. The next part of inner right speech is refraining from harmful speech directed at yourself. Many people call themselves names automatically. They say, "I'm stupid. I always ruin things. I'll never get better. I'm a burden." These sentences may feel casual, but the mind receives them like commands. The nervous system tightens, the breath shortens, the body prepares for danger because harmful words trigger survival responses. When harmful speech becomes frequent, the mind learns to anticipate it and begins shrinking, hiding, or resisting life. That resistance becomes chronic stress, and chronic stress becomes suffering. When you stop attacking yourself with words, your energy shifts. You no longer drain your strength trying to recover from wounds you caused yourself. You begin walking through life with more ease because the struggle inside is no longer fighting against your own voice. Right speech, inward, also means refraining from exaggeration in self-judgment. The mind loves absolutes. Always, never, forever. These words trap you in fixed identity. They pull you away from growth. If you tell yourself you always fail, you blind yourself to progress. If you tell yourself you never get things right, you ignore every moment you have succeeded. These exaggerations are subtle forms of self-harm because they distort reality and make it harder to act wisely. Right speech brings balance. It teaches you to see clearly, not through the lens of self-attack or self-pity, but through steady awareness. Another aspect of inward right speech is avoiding useless inner chatter. Not daydreaming, not creativity, but the kind of storytelling that drains your mind with no benefit. Replaying arguments, predicting rejection, manufacturing criticism before it even happens. This inner noise steals focus, steals peace, steals energy you could use for something meaningful. The mind gets stuck in loops, not because it wants to, but because it has been trained to rehearse harm. Right speech interrupts these loops by guiding the mind back to what is real, present, and workable. Right speech toward oneself also includes kindness. Kindness inside is not flattery. It is not pretending everything is fine. It is acknowledging the effort you make. It is giving yourself permission to rest when you are tired. It is reminding yourself that growth takes time. It is offering words that soothe rather than ignite fear. This kindness is not childish. It is skillful. A mind treated with care becomes resilient. A mind treated with cruelty becomes fragile, and fragility makes life heavier than it needs to be. Compassion is also a form of inner right speech. When you speak to yourself with compassion, you treat your pain with warmth instead of judgment. You don't shame yourself for feeling overwhelmed. You don't punish yourself for not knowing everything. You don't attack yourself for needing support. Compassion inside softens the edges of suffering. It turns the mind into a place where healing can happen. Without compassion, the mind becomes a battlefield. With compassion, it becomes a refuge. Right speech turned inward also requires intention. Many people speak to themselves unconsciously. They repeat old scripts without noticing them. Inner right speech means speaking deliberately. It means directing your thoughts with awareness. It means choosing not to repeat inherited voices that never belonged to you. When you speak with intention, your inner life becomes grounded, purposeful, and peaceful. You begin to trust your own mind again. Inner right speech aligns your inner world with the Eightfold Path. It is a daily practice, not a one-time decision. It becomes part of the way you breathe, think, and react. Every time you catch a harmful thought, you practice. Every time you reframe a self-attack into a clear truth, you practice. Every time you show yourself understanding during a difficult moment, you practice. Gradually, the inner climate changes. The mind becomes quieter, softer, clearer. You begin to feel safe inside your own thoughts, and that safety becomes strength. When you practice right speech internally, the external world shifts because you meet it with a different state. You become less reactive because you no longer carry the burden of inner hostility. You become more patient because your self-talk is no longer filled with urgency and pressure. You become more confident because you are not tearing yourself down before you begin. You become more open-hearted because you no longer treat yourself as an enemy. This is the power of applying the Eightfold Path inwardly. Your relationship with everything changes because your relationship with yourself changes first. There is one more layer. Inner right speech affects the future. The words you speak inside today influence the conditions of tomorrow. If you speak with criticism, tomorrow's mind becomes heavier. If you speak with clarity, tomorrow's mind becomes steadier. If you speak with compassion, tomorrow's mind becomes kinder. Karma is not punishment. Karma is continuity. The inner voice you choose now becomes the emotional climate you wake up to later. This continuity is why inner right speech matters so deeply. It carries forward. It shapes your direction even when you are not aware of it. And so the practice grows. You begin noticing when your inner tone turns sharp. You begin stepping back from thoughts that harm you. You begin replacing cruelty with clarity, harshness with steadiness, judgment with compassion. This does not mean weakness. This does not mean denial. This means skillful speech. Speech that reduces suffering and opens space for growth. Speech that honors the truth without harming the heart. The inner version of the same commitment you offer the world. Right speech is not complete until it lives inside you. Your inner world is part of the path. Your inner words are part of the path, and when those words become aligned with kindness, clarity, honesty, and care, the whole mind shifts from a place of struggle to a place of balance, and from that balance, everything else becomes lighter. When you finally begin treating your inner voice as part of the path, something deeper begins to surface. You start noticing that beneath all the noise, beneath the habits and fears and old stories, there is a quieter layer that feels older than your struggles and wiser than your reactions. The moment you stop attacking yourself inwardly, that deeper layer has space to rise. And this leads directly into a truth many forget. The path does not lead you to your Buddha nature. Your path begins when you recognize it is already there. From this point on, the way you speak to yourself is no longer about fixing a broken self. It becomes about speaking to the part of you that has always been whole but rarely acknowledged. There is a shift that happens when you stop speaking to yourself as a damaged person, trying to become better, and begin speaking to yourself as someone who already holds the seed of awakening. You stop using language that reinforces helplessness and start using words that remind the mind of its own depth. You begin talking to yourself with the same respect you would offer to someone you deeply admire. This shift is powerful because the mind responds differently depending on the way you address it. When you speak from the assumption that you are fundamentally flawed, the mind contracts. When you speak from the assumption that you already contain wisdom, the mind opens. It starts behaving in alignment with the identity you give it. To speak to yourself as if you were already enlightened does not mean pretending to be perfect. It means speaking from the side of you that is capable of clarity, compassion, stillness, and understanding. Everyone has that side, even when it feels far away. When you speak to yourself from that level, you call it forward. You strengthen it. You deepen it through repetition. Buddhism teaches that what you feed grows. If you feed self-doubt with constant reminders of weakness, it expands. If you feed your inner Buddha with language rooted in dignity, patience, and kindness, that presence grows stronger. Treating yourself as if you were already enlightened changes the emotional environment inside you. Instead of scolding yourself for feeling anxious, the inner Buddha speaks with understanding. Instead of calling yourself worthless for making a mistake, that inner wisdom acknowledges the pain without attacking the person feeling it. Instead of reacting to every emotion as if it defines you, the inner Buddha sees each emotion as a passing wave. Speaking to yourself from this place doesn't erase your challenges, but it changes the way you meet them. Your difficulties stop becoming proof of failure and start becoming opportunities to practice awareness. When the Buddha spoke of awakening, he described it not as becoming something new, but as uncovering what has always been present. The sunlight is already behind the clouds. Your inner Buddha nature is already behind the confusion. Speaking to yourself as if you were already enlightened means addressing yourself as the one who can see through the clouds, not as the clouds themselves. You stop saying, "I am the storm," and begin saying, "A storm is passing through me." This subtle shift becomes the difference between drowning in suffering and finding ground within suffering. Your inner Buddha is not harsh. It does not shame. It does not belittle. It does not rush. It does not demand perfection. It guides with patience. It understands the weight you carry without adding more weight. When you speak from this place, you begin to feel supported by your own mind rather than attacked by it. Many people collapse under pressure not because life is unbearable, but because their inner voice gives no support, no room to breathe, no gentleness. When you speak to yourself as if you already have an enlightened heart, your inner world becomes a place where healing can finally occur. There is a profound strength in addressing yourself with dignity. You begin to stand differently in your own life. You stop begging for worth from the outside because you begin to sense it within. Speaking to yourself this way does not inflate the ego, it strengthens humility. The inner Buddha speaks softly because it has nothing to prove. When your inner voice takes on that same tone, the ego loses its grip. Fear loses its grip. You begin acting from clarity rather than insecurity. Speaking to yourself as if you were already enlightened also means speaking from the perspective of wisdom rather than confusion. Instead of, "I can't handle this," the inner Buddha says, "This is difficult, but I can meet it step by step." Instead of, "I am broken," it says, "I am hurting and I deserve care." Instead of, "I will fail," it says, "I will learn." These are not empty phrases. They guide the mind toward groundedness rather than panic. They direct attention toward possibilities rather than limitations. When you talk to yourself as if you were already awakened, you begin to see your emotions differently. You stop interpreting every feeling as a problem. Anger becomes a signal, not a flaw. Fear becomes a message, not a weakness. Sadness becomes a response, not a personal failure. Speaking to yourself this way turns suffering into information, and information can be understood, processed, and worked with. The inner Buddha does not fight emotions. It listens to them. It learns from them. It holds them without letting them control the whole mind. This kind of inner speech expands your capacity to stay present. When you speak to yourself with wisdom, you stop running from discomfort. You stop spiraling into fear. You stop feeding thoughts that harm you. Instead, you meet each moment with steadiness. The mind becomes less reactive because it feels held, and when the mind feels held, it can settle. This is the practical meaning of speaking to yourself as if enlightened. The mind finds a stable center even when the world is unstable. Over time, the inner Buddha voice becomes second nature. You begin catching harmful thoughts faster because they feel out of place. They no longer match the identity you speak from. When you speak to yourself like someone who is already rooted in clarity, the mind becomes less interested in the chaotic patterns it used to cling to. You begin choosing thoughts that preserve balance rather than destroy it. You begin moving through difficulties with a level of patience that surprises even you. This internal transformation reshapes the way you move in the world. You become less defensive because you are not constantly attacked by yourself. You become more patient with others because you are more patient with your own struggles. You become less judgmental because you stop judging yourself so harshly. When you treat yourself as if you are already enlightened, you naturally extend that treatment outward. Compassion flows more freely because compassion is now your inner language. And something unexpected happens. You begin trusting yourself. Trust grows when the inner voice stops turning against you. When the mind becomes a safe place, decisions become clearer. You stop doubting every step. You stop fearing every mistake. You begin understanding that you can handle life because the voice guiding you is no longer destructive. This trust is not ego. It is quiet stability. It is the confidence that grows when the inner Buddha becomes the one speaking. The more you practice speaking to yourself this way, the more you reshape your inner world. You begin replacing language that reinforces ignorance with language that awakens understanding. Instead of repeating old stories that limit you, you speak from the part of you that sees beyond them. You honor the wisdom that already exists within you, even if you are still learning how to access it. And learning becomes easier because the inner environment no longer resists growth. When you speak to yourself as if already enlightened, you begin to see your life through a larger lens. You stop shrinking yourself to past mistakes. You stop defining yourself by old circumstances. You stop confusing temporary states with your true nature. Speech becomes medicine. It becomes practice. It becomes the way you remind yourself of what is real instead of what fear tells you is real. When you begin speaking to yourself as if wisdom already lives inside you, something unexpected happens. Your inner world becomes quieter, but it also becomes clearer. You start noticing patterns you once overlooked. You start seeing how much unnecessary pain comes not from life itself, but from the way you react to life in your own mind. That realization naturally leads to one of the most powerful teachings in Buddhism, the truth of the second arrow. And once you see how often you hurt yourself with your own thoughts, you begin to understand why compassionate inner speech is not optional. It is the difference between a moment of difficulty and a spiral of suffering. There is a simple truth that carries enormous weight. Pain is part of being alive, but the mind often adds extra pain on top of it. You drop something important and feel frustration. That is the first arrow. Then your inner voice says, "You're so careless. You always mess things up. What's wrong with you?" That is the second arrow. The second arrow does far more damage than the first. It turns a moment into a wound. It turns a mistake into a personal attack. It turns a human experience into a story of shame. Compassionate self-speech is the only thing that stops this second arrow from landing. It interrupts the force of old habits that turn every challenge into proof against yourself. When your inner Buddha speaks, the second arrow loses its power. The mind learns to treat pain with understanding instead of hostility. And life becomes easier, not because the world changes, but because you stop adding suffering that never needed to be there. The second arrow appears in many forms. It shows up when you criticize yourself for feeling stressed. It shows up when you blame yourself for emotions you didn't choose. It shows up when you shame yourself for not knowing something sooner. The mind reacts to the first arrow naturally, but the second arrow is optional. That option becomes clear only when you slow down enough to notice the tone of your inner speech. Without awareness, the second arrow lands automatically. With awareness, you can soften the moment before it deepens into suffering. Compassionate inner speech begins with recognizing that pain itself is not a failure. Many people attack themselves the moment they feel discomfort because they believe they should be stronger, calmer, or more in control. But the inner Buddha understands that pain is not a sign of weakness. Pain is a sign of being human. Speaking to yourself with compassion means acknowledging the reality of the moment without creating a story that punishes you for experiencing it. This simple shift reduces the emotional noise that intensifies suffering. When you replace the second arrow with gentle speech, the nervous system reacts differently. Instead of tightening, it relaxes. Instead of spiraling into panic, it settles. Instead of searching for what is wrong with you, it searches for what would help you. Compassionate self-talk guides the mind towards soothing instead of attacking, And when the mind feels soothed, suffering dissolves much faster than when the mind feels assaulted. The second arrow also appears in rumination. Something bothers you, and instead of letting the discomfort pass, the mind circles it over and over with judgment. Why am I still thinking about this? Why can't I move on? What is wrong with me? This internal hostility keeps reopening the emotional wound. The mind becomes trapped in a cycle of self-inflicted injury. Compassionate speech breaks the cycle by speaking from patience instead of impatience. It makes sense that this is still on my mind. It was meaningful. It touched something tender. I can be gentle with myself while it settles. When the mind hears this tone, it relaxes its grip and allows the emotion to move. Many people think compassion means letting themselves off the hook. But compassionate inner speech is not indulgence. It is skillful action. The mind learns better from patience than from punishment. The second arrow drains your energy, but compassion restores it. When you stop stabbing yourself emotionally, you have more strength to deal with the first arrow wisely. Compassionate self-speech during suffering also means speaking in a way that cools the emotion rather than inflames it. Harsh speech intensifies anger. Harsh speech amplifies shame. Harsh speech feeds anxiety. But gentle words soften everything they touch. They help the mind widen instead of collapse. A widened mind can see clearly. A collapsed mind cannot. This clarity is essential because without it, the mind reacts impulsively, often creating more pain. Another way the second arrow appears is through comparison. When you are going through something hard, the mind may say, "Other people handle this better. Other people don't break down. Other people are stronger." This comparison adds an unnecessary layer of pain on top of what you're already experiencing. Compassionate inner speech removes this arrow by reminding you that your experience is uniquely yours. It does not need to match anyone else's. Your suffering is not a flaw. It is a moment that deserves care. The second arrow also shows up in the form of self-blame. You feel sad, and your mind says, "This is your fault." You feel tired, and your mind says, "You shouldn't be tired." You feel afraid, and your mind says, "If you were better, you wouldn't feel this." These thoughts turn natural human emotions into personal failures. Compassionate speech transforms the inner atmosphere by saying, "This is hard, but it's okay to feel this way. I don't need to punish myself for having a difficult moment." This kind of speech does not ignore responsibility. It simply removes cruelty from responsibility. The inner Buddha sees suffering clearly, but responds to it gently. When you speak to yourself from this place, you stop escalating your pain. You stop turning discomfort into identity. You stop turning mistakes into character defects. You stop turning temporary challenges into permanent truths. Instead, you meet each moment with a voice that understands, supports, and guides. Compassionate self-speech also strengthens resilience. When the second arrow is removed, you recover faster from difficulties. Your mind stays clearer, your emotions remain more balanced, and your actions become more skillful. You stop wasting energy on internal battles and start using that energy to move through real problems with focus and calmness. This is the practical value of speaking to yourself with compassion. It is not sentimental, it is effective. Over time, compassionate speech creates a pattern. The mind learns that suffering is not a threat. Pain no longer triggers panic. Difficulty no longer triggers collapse. When you treat yourself with kindness during hard moments, the mind begins to trust itself. It begins to understand that no matter what happens, it will not be abandoned internally. That trust becomes one of the deepest forms of inner stability. Many people misunderstand compassion as weakness, but in Buddhism, compassion is a form of courage. It takes strength to stay soft in moments that could harden you. It takes awareness to pause before firing the second arrow. It takes wisdom to speak kindly to yourself when everything inside feels tight. Compassion is not a passive state. It is a conscious act of ending unnecessary suffering. Speaking gently to yourself during the second arrow also teaches you emotional literacy. You start learning the difference between pain that needs attention and suffering that needs release. You begin understanding what your emotions are trying to communicate instead of fighting them blindly. You start listening to yourself with the same respect you offer others. This listening itself is healing. It transforms the mind from a hostile environment into a supportive one. When you stop firing the second arrow, you create space for healing. Pain moves more freely. Emotion settles more naturally. Stress doesn't accumulate the same way. You start responding to life with clarity instead of fear. You stop avoiding challenges because you no longer fear your own reactions. You start trusting your ability to navigate difficulty because you are no longer battling yourself while doing so. When you stop adding the second arrow, the mind begins to breathe again. You feel more space inside, more room to move, more clarity to see what is actually happening instead of drowning in what your thoughts are adding. This is the moment when a new insight begins to appear. The voice inside your head is not a single voice. There are many tones, many layers, many echoes from different stages of your life. Some voices try to help. Some voices try to protect. Some voices attack. Some voices comfort. Realizing this opens the door to the next step on the path. Understanding that your inner world can become a sangha, a community of supportive voices instead of a battlefield of critical ones. There is something powerful about noticing you are not limited to one inner narrator. The harsh critic that used to dominate your thoughts is not the only voice available. It only became loud because it was repeated. But just as it was created, it can be replaced. The mind is not fixed. It is a community waiting for guidance. When you start choosing which voices to strengthen, your inner world transforms into something far more supportive and stable than you ever expected. A sangha, in Buddhist tradition, is a community that uplifts and protects its members through compassion, wisdom, and steady presence. Bringing this inside yourself means building inner voices that resemble wise monks instead of inner bullies. These inner figures offer guidance instead of judgment, comfort instead of punishment, and clarity instead of confusion. The mind becomes a place where you feel accompanied rather than attacked. The first part of building an inner sangha is recognizing the voices already living inside you. Some developed from childhood experiences, some formed through repeated habits. Some reflect old fears. Some carry past pain. You may hear the anxious voice that worries about everything, the exhausted voice that wants to withdraw, the ambitious voice that pushes too hard, the perfectionist voice that is never satisfied. Instead of fighting these voices, the Sangha approach lets you acknowledge them with compassion. They are not your enemy. They are inner beings shaped by your history. Each one is trying to protect you in its own limited way. When you stop fighting these voices and start understanding them, their grip softens. The anxious voice calms when it feels heard. The perfectionist eases when you give it support. The wounded voice loosens when it feels compassion. Developing an inner Sangha means gathering these parts and giving them new leadership. A wise, steady, compassionate voice that guides the whole inner community with patience. This new guiding voice is not imaginary. It is the part of you that has always sought peace, the part that longs for clarity, the part that has survived every difficult moment. This voice becomes the anchor for the rest. When it speaks, the others respond differently. You begin hearing, "It's okay, you're doing your best," instead of, "You're failing again." You begin hearing, "Let's take this step by step," instead of, "You should have done better." You begin hearing, "You deserve rest," instead of, "You don't deserve anything until you fix everything." When this wise inner voice leads, the other voices start aligning with it. The anxious voice becomes more cautious than panicked. The perfectionist becomes more helpful than harmful. The wounded voice becomes more honest than reactive. You are not suppressing any voice. You are supporting them in a healthier way. This is the heart of creating a Sangha within. The whole inner system becomes cooperative instead of chaotic. Another part of this practice is inviting new voices into your inner world. These voices come from qualities you admire: patience, forgiveness, understanding, balance, courage. These qualities can be spoken into existence through practice. When you repeat compassionate sentences often enough, they develop into a recognizable internal presence. When you cultivate patience, a patient voice begins to form. When you practice self-forgiveness, a forgiving voice learns to speak. Over time, the mind becomes populated with wise reminders instead of constant criticism. Creating an inner Sangha also means learning to let supportive voices interrupt harmful ones. When the critic starts to attack, the compassionate voice steps in and says, "Hold on, this person is hurting. Let's speak gently." When the anxious voice spirals, the grounded voice says, "Let's breathe together." When the perfectionist panics, the wise voice says, "We don't need perfection, we need progress." These interruptions begin to rewire your emotional habits. The mind learns that fear does not get to dictate your identity. Shame does not get to lead your decisions. Anger does not get to define who you are. As you develop more supportive inner voices, the emotional weight inside you becomes easier to carry. Life's challenges feel less overwhelming because you are no longer facing them alone. Your mind becomes a team rather than a threat. Even during moments of stress, you hear a steady voice guiding you back to center. This inner support reduces the intensity of anxiety, smooths the edges of sadness, and keeps anger from turning inward. You begin trusting your mind because it speaks to you with respect. The Sangha within also mirrors the wisdom of external communities. Monastics support each other by reminding one another of teachings during difficult times. Your inner voices can do the same. When doubt arises, the wise voice reminds you of your strength. When shame appears, the compassionate voice recalls your worth. When confusion grows, the grounded voice brings clarity. This is not fantasy, it is mental training. The mind adapts to whatever voices you feed most often. Some people believe they have only one inner voice, but this is because one part of them became louder than the rest. Developing a Sangha means giving space to the voices that never had a chance to grow. The voice that encourages you, the voice that sees your effort, the voice that comforts you when you feel alone, the voice that understands your pain without judging it. These voices exist within everyone, but they need attention to become strong. Over time, your inner Sangha begins influencing the way you live. You become more patient with others because you are more patient with yourself. You become more grounded because your inner guidance is stable. You become more compassionate because your inner world has become a place of compassion rather than hostility. This transformation changes your reactions, your choices, and your sense of self. Your inner Sangha also protects you from internalizing harmful voices from the outside world. When someone criticizes you unfairly, the wise voice inside says, "This is about them, not about your worth." When someone speaks without kindness, the compassionate voice says, "Their words do not define you." When someone dismisses your feelings, the supportive voice says, "Your emotions are valid." In this way, the Sangha within shields your heart from unnecessary suffering. A strong internal community also makes it easier to break harmful habits. The critic alone cannot change habits, it only punishes. The anxious voice cannot change habits, it only warns. But the wise inner voice can guide the whole system toward better choices. It can negotiate with fear, calm the perfectionist, reassure the wounded part, and move the mind toward healthier actions. The Sangha approach is not about suppressing any inner voice. It is about giving them proper leadership. With practice, the supportive voices become louder and the harmful voices lose strength, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer fed with attention. The critic loses its dominance because the compassionate voice speaks more often. The fearful voice quiets because the grounded voice has become stronger. The wounded voice stops screaming because it finally feels understood. This internal harmony allows you to live more fully. You stop wasting energy fighting yourself. You begin focusing on what matters. Your inner world feels lighter, clearer, more stable. You begin trusting your journey because you are supported at every step from within. And this support becomes unconditional, not based on achievement, not based on perfection, not based on pleasing others, but simply based on recognizing your own humanity. When your inner world starts to feel more like a supportive community and less like a courtroom, something very subtle begins to stand out. You notice that even on days when you're kinder to yourself, there are still small, sharp edges in your thinking, quick jabs, little sighs of contempt, tiny sentences that seem harmless on the surface but leave a sting behind. They slip through because they don't sound as loud as open self-hatred, yet they still hurt. They still shape how safe you feel inside your own mind. This is where the next layer of the path unfolds, learning the art of non-violent thought. There is a kind of pain so quiet you almost miss it. A quiet flinch in your chest after you mutter, "Of course you did that," in a bitter tone to yourself. A tiny drop in your stomach when your mind whispers, "Typical you," after a small mistake. These thoughts don't scream, they don't shout, but they erode. They wear you down slowly, like water on stone. By the end of the day, you feel heavy, small, tired, and you're not even sure why. You just feel off. This is the cost of subtle aggression toward yourself. Non-violent thought is not just the absence of loud self-hate. It is the absence of quiet cruelty. It is the choice to no longer tolerate small inner attacks that you've been calling normal your whole life. In Buddhist practice, Non-harming is one of the deepest commitments. Most people think of it only in terms of actions, not hurting others, not killing, not abusing. But the mind can harm without moving a muscle. A single contemptuous thought toward yourself leaves a mark on your nervous system. Your body hears it. Your breath hears it. Your heart hears it. Non-violent thought is about ending that internal harm. Subtle aggression in thought often hides behind jokes you make about yourself. You say, "Well, I'm an idiot," and laugh. But part of you doesn't laugh. Part of you listens and shrinks just a little. Or you roll your eyes internally. "You're so dramatic. Get over it." You snap at your own pain as if it was something disgusting. These are micro-attacks, and they add up. One by one, they train your system to believe it doesn't deserve tenderness. Another form of micro-violence is the constant use of should as a weapon. You should be over this by now. You should not feel this way. You should have known better. The word itself may sound neutral, but the emotional tone behind it is often harsh. It carries disappointment and scorn. It treats your current state as unacceptable and intolerable. Under that pressure, your body tightens, your thoughts race, and your feelings start to hide. You're no longer just dealing with what you feel, you're fighting against your right to feel it. There is also the aggression of erasure. You feel sad and immediately say, "It's not a big deal," even though a part of you knows it is. You feel anxious and tell yourself, "Stop being so sensitive," instead of asking why the fear is there. You downplay your own experiences, dismiss your needs, and treat your wounds as an inconvenience. On the surface, this looks calm, but beneath that calm is a quiet act of violence. You deny your own reality. That denial does not make the feelings vanish. It pushes them deeper, where they turn into tension, numbness, or silent despair. Another subtle attack is suspicion toward yourself, that inner voice that constantly questions your motives in the worst possible light. You do something kind, and a thought says, "You're just doing this to look good." You rest when you're tired, and a thought says, "You're just lazy." You speak up for yourself, and a thought says, "You're overreacting." This inner suspicion creates an atmosphere where you can never win. No matter what you do, you are guilty. That is mental violence. It imprisons you in permanent self-doubt. Non-violent thought does not mean you never evaluate your actions. It means you stop stabbing your own heart while you do it. You can acknowledge mistakes without calling yourself names. You can reflect on choices without stripping yourself of dignity. You can ask, "What can I learn from this?" instead of, "What is wrong with me?" The first question opens a path forward. The second one slams the door. There is also the aggression of constant inner urgency. The thought that hisses, "Hurry up, fix this now. You're behind, you're late, you don't have time to feel this." This internal pushing is often praised as ambition or discipline, but when it's rooted in fear and self-contempt, it becomes harmful. Your nervous system never comes down. Your body never fully exhales. You live in permanent inner alarm, as if you are always just one step away from being exposed as a failure. That state wears down your health, your joy, and your ability to be present. The art of non-violent thought starts with recognition. You cannot soften what you refuse to see. The task is not to condemn yourself for having harsh thoughts. That would just be more violence. The task is to watch your thinking with the same careful attention a healer uses when examining a wound. You notice the small dig. Of course you messed that up. You notice the subtle dismissal. You're being ridiculous. You notice the automatic verdict. This proves you'll never change. You see these as events in the mind, not truth. Once you see these micro-attacks, the next step is to interrupt them, not by force, but by introducing a different tone. When the thought says, "Typical you," you pause and respond internally. "I'm human. People make mistakes." When the inner voice snaps, "Get over it," you respond, "I'm allowed to feel what I feel." When the critic hisses, "You're so weak," you respond, "I'm doing my best under my current limits." This is not arguing. This is replacing violence with care. Language matters deeply. Violent thoughts often use labels: loser, idiot, useless, crazy, pathetic. Non-violent thought prefers descriptions over labels. Instead of "I'm pathetic," you might say, "I feel very small right now." Instead of "I'm a disaster," you might say, "I am overwhelmed." Descriptive language tells the truth about your state without attacking your identity. It lets the mind see experiences as temporary, not permanent condemnations. Tone matters as much as words. You can say the same sentence with two very different inner tones. "You're tired" can be said as a complaint or as concern. A complaint says, "You're tired, and that's a problem." Concern says, "You're tired, and you deserve care." In the art of non-violent thought, you are training not just the content of your thoughts, but the emotional flavor behind them. You are teaching your mind to approach you the way a kind teacher would approach a struggling student. Non-violent thought is closely connected to the body. Subtle aggression tightens your muscles, locks your jaw, hardens your face. Gentler inner speech softens these areas naturally. One powerful practice is to check your body each time you notice a sharp thought. Does your chest clench? Does your stomach sink? Do your shoulders tense? These physical signals show you how much impact a single thought has. Then you pair a softer thought with a conscious softening of the body, loosening the jaw, dropping the shoulders, lengthening the exhale. The mind learns that gentle thinking and physical ease go together. Another important aspect of non-violent thought is acknowledging the purpose behind your old mental habits. Many harsh inner patterns started as attempts to protect you. The inner critic thought it could keep you safe by shaming you before someone else did. The harsh taskmaster thought it could prevent failure by never letting you rest. The dismissive voice thought it could help you survive by numbing you to pain. When you see this, you stop treating your harsh thoughts as monsters and start seeing them as clumsy protectors. Then you can thank them for what they tried to do and gently retire them from their role. You might say inside, "I know you're trying to protect me by pushing me so hard, but you're hurting me now. I'm choosing a different way." Or, "You're trying to keep me from being hurt again by criticizing me first. But I don't need that anymore. I need support." This kind of dialogue transforms the relationship you have with your own mind. You are not at war with your thoughts. You are educating them. Non-violent thought also involves setting limits with inner aggression. Just as you would walk away from someone who constantly insults you, you can step back from thoughts that do the same. When a deeply cruel thought arises, you can mentally say, "No, I'm not giving energy to that." Then shift your attention to something neutral: your breath, the feeling of your feet on the ground, the sounds around you. This is not denial. You are not pretending the thought never arose. You are choosing not to feed it. You are refusing to let it define your reality. An important part of this art is patience. Violent thinking patterns are often old and repetitive. They will not vanish in a day. Some thoughts will keep returning, like stubborn guests. Non-violent thought means you respond to their return without violence toward yourself for still having them. Each time they appear, you offer a different response. Each time you speak 1 degree softer. Over time, the emotional charge decreases. The sharpened edges get duller. The mind slowly learns that it doesn't need to attack you in order to function. Non-violent thought affects the way you relate to your own history. Instead of replaying past events with self-disgust, you look back with understanding. You see younger versions of yourself acting with the limited tools they had at that time. You stop narrating your story as, "I ruined everything," and start seeing it as, "I was hurting and didn't know another way." This gentler narrative does not excuse harm, but it removes inner brutality. It opens the door to true repentance and change, rather than endless self-torment. As non-violent thought grows, your daily inner dialogue changes texture. You wake up, and the first thoughts are no longer, "You're already behind," or "You look awful." Instead, they become, "You're here, you get another day, take it slowly." During tasks, instead of constant self-commentary full of criticism, you hear neutral or encouraging lines. "One thing at a time. This is hard, but you're doing it." Before sleep, instead of replaying every flaw, the mind begins to say, "You made it through another day. Rest now." These shifts sound small, but they change the emotional ground you walk on. A mind that has learned non-violent thought becomes safer to live in. You no longer dread being alone with your thoughts because your thoughts no longer attack you. Silence becomes less frightening. Reflection becomes less painful. You can sit with yourself without wanting to run away. That inner safety is one of the most healing experiences you can give yourself. And from that safety, growth becomes real. You are free to explore, to learn, to change, without fear that every misstep will be used as ammunition against you. You become more honest with yourself, because honesty is no longer punished. You become more open to feedback, because it isn't layered on top of ongoing inner abuse. You become more resilient, because your mind no longer turns every challenge into a weapon. This is the art of non-violent thought, ending quiet harm, honoring your own inner experience, and training your mind to talk to you the way a wise, gentle companion would. It is a daily practice, a sentence at a time, a tone at a time. But each small shift creates a new kind of life inside you, one where your own mind is no longer a place of danger, but a place of refuge. When the mind learns the art of non-violent thought, something deeper starts to shake loose beneath the surface. Those tiny inner attacks you used to overlook were never random. They were echoes, leftovers, old emotional scripts that began long before you knew how to recognize them. Once you stop harming yourself with subtle thoughts, you begin to hear the older voices inside you, the ones you absorbed in childhood without choosing them. This is where the next step on the path opens: mindful reparenting, the practice of speaking to yourself in a way you never received, rewriting the emotional patterns that shaped your early life. There is a quiet truth that can hit with surprising force. Much of the pain you feel toward yourself was taught to you. Not always through words, sometimes through tone, absence, tension, or silence. Maybe you learned early on that your feelings were too much. Maybe you learned that you had to earn love. Maybe you learned that mistakes made you unworthy. These lessons settled into your body and became automatic responses. They became the voice you think is your own. But the moment you recognize they were learned, you realize they can also be unlearned. Mindful reparenting begins with the awareness that the inner critic, the anxious voice, the fearful part, the ashamed part, none of them came from nowhere. They were formed in environments where you had no choice but to adapt. You shaped yourself around the emotional landscape of the people who raised you. You absorbed their tone, their fears, their expectations, their wounds. You carried them forward because children do not analyze their environment, they survive it. And now, as an adult, your self-talk still echoes those early patterns unless you consciously rewrite them. Reparenting is not about blaming the past. It is about understanding the roots of your current reactions so you can stop punishing yourself for patterns you inherited. When a harsh thought appears, instead of treating it as truth, you begin treating it as a message from a younger part of you asking for help. That shift alone can change the way you respond internally. You stop attacking yourself for struggling and start asking what the struggling part needs. A core part of reparenting is giving yourself the tone you never had. If your early environment was tense, you learn to speak to yourself with steadiness. If it was dismissive, you learn to speak with understanding. If it was controlling, you learn to speak with freedom. If it was unpredictable, you learn to speak with consistency. Each time you choose a different tone, you rewrite an emotional script that once felt permanent. Many childhood wounds come from not being seen or understood. Reparenting begins with recognizing your own feelings instead of ignoring or belittling them. When a wave of sadness rises, the old script might say, "Stop being dramatic." Reparenting replaces this with, "You're hurting, I'm here." That simple sentence, said internally, begins to reshape the nervous system. It creates safety where there used to be fear. It gives the younger parts of you the response they should have received long ago. Another wound many people carry is the belief that their needs are inconvenient. As a child, this belief teaches you to shrink yourself. As an adult, it shows up in self-talk like, "Don't bother anyone," or "Handle it alone," or "You're too needy." Mindful reparenting challenges those patterns by validating your needs instead of shaming them. When a need arises, you tell yourself, "Your needs matter. It's okay to ask for support." Over time, your sense of worth becomes grounded instead of fragile. Reparenting also involves giving yourself the permission you never received. Permission to rest, permission to take up space, permission to speak honestly, permission to slow down, permission to feel. Many children learn to suppress everything that might create conflict or discomfort. Those suppressed emotions don't disappear, they become self-judgment later. When you consciously give yourself permission to exist as you are, you break a karmic pattern that may have carried through generations. One of the most powerful aspects of reparenting is learning to comfort yourself without minimizing your experience. Many people were raised with responses like, "You're fine," "It's not that bad," or "Stop crying." These phrases teach a child to distrust their own emotional reality. As an adult, you may repeat those same sentences to yourself, thinking they help, but they only deepen the wound. Reparenting means offering comfort that acknowledges your pain instead of erasing it. "This hurts. It's okay that it hurts. I'm not leaving myself alone with this." These words send a completely different signal to your mind and body. Another part of reparenting is consistency. If your early life was unpredictable, emotionally or physically, you may now carry anxiety that flares even when nothing is wrong. Your inner system learned to expect sudden shifts. Mindful reparenting means becoming the stable presence you never had. You show up for yourself every day with some form of steady inner speech, reassurance, grounding, kindness. Consistency is one of the strongest forms of love the mind can receive because it counteracts the chaos of the past. Reparenting also involves boundaries with your inner critic. Many people were raised in environments where criticism was constant, unpredictable, or weaponized. As adults, they internalize that critic and use it on themselves. Reparenting means learning to say no more to that voice. You don't argue with it, you set limits. When it starts to attack, you say internally, I don't speak to myself this way anymore. This boundary may feel strange at first, but over time it becomes a powerful act of protection toward yourself. There is also the emotional repair of learning to speak to yourself with encouragement instead of pressure. Children who grew up with unrealistic expectations often develop self-talk that only values achievement. Anything less triggers shame. Reparenting shifts the focus from performance to presence. Instead of, you have to do this perfectly, the inner voice learns to say, you're trying. That matters. That shift can break decades of internalized pressure. Another essential layer of reparenting is giving yourself the warmth you missed. Not everyone grew up with affection. Not everyone heard gentle tones. Not everyone felt welcomed. When you begin offering yourself warmth through your inner speech, simple phrases like, I care about you, I'm here for you. You don't have to handle this alone. Your mind and body begin healing in places that logic alone could never reach. Warmth communicates safety. Safety allows growth. Reparenting also requires updating the emotional rules you learned as a child. Maybe you learned that expressing feelings brings punishment, or that speaking up brings conflict, or that showing vulnerability results in rejection. These rules may still guide your behavior unconsciously. Through reparenting, you rewrite these rules with more accurate ones. My feelings are allowed. My needs matter. Vulnerability does not make me unsafe. I deserve to be heard. These new rules reshape your emotional reactions and your sense of identity. Many people also carry the karmic pattern of self-blame from childhood. When children don't understand why adults around them are upset, they assume it must be their fault. This belief becomes automatic and continues into adulthood. Reparenting challenges this pattern by teaching you to separate your worth from other people's behavior. When guilt rises without cause, the reparenting voice says, this is not your fault. You are not responsible for other people's emotions. With repetition, this releases you from carrying pain that never belonged to you. Another powerful aspect of reparenting is speaking to the younger parts of yourself directly. When old pain rises, you talk to that inner child the way a loving parent would, with patience, kindness, and certainty. You say things like, I know you're scared. I'm here. I won't ignore you. This is not imagination. It is emotional integration. It is how fragmented parts of you learn that the present is safer than the past. Reparenting also involves giving yourself the guidance you didn't receive. Many people grew up without emotional coaching. No one taught them how to name feelings, how to calm themselves, or how to navigate conflict. Reparenting fills this gap. When you feel overwhelmed, the inner parent says, "Let's take one step at a time." When you feel confused, it says, "Let's slow down and figure this out." When you feel lost, it says, "We will find a way." These phrases create internal direction and stability. An essential part of reparenting is developing a compassionate narrative around your younger self. Instead of looking back at your childhood with judgment, "I should have known better," you begin seeing your younger self through the lens of tenderness. You say, "You were trying, you were learning, you were surviving." That compassion rewrites old memories, releasing emotional knots that have been tied for years. Reparenting also transforms your relationship with failure. Children raised with harsh reactions often internalize fear of mistakes. As adults, they avoid risks, silence themselves, or over-prepare for everything. Reparenting offers a new approach. You can make mistakes and still be safe. This sentence alone can open doors inside the mind that have been locked for decades. A reparented inner voice treats rest differently too. Children who were pushed too hard learn to shame themselves for slowing down. Mindful reparenting replaces that shame with permission. You're tired. Rest is allowed. This changes more than your schedule. It changes your worthiness pattern. It teaches your mind that you do not need to earn the right to exist peacefully. Another deep layer is grieving what you didn't receive. Reparenting is not pretending your childhood was perfect. It is acknowledging what was missing so you can give it to yourself now. This grief is not weakness. It is clearing emotional space. When you allow space for this grief, your self-talk becomes more honest, more compassionate, and more rooted in reality. Mindful reparenting ultimately teaches you how to become an internal source of love, safety, consistency, and understanding. You stop waiting for someone else to heal your wounds. You stop repeating the patterns that hurt you. You begin speaking to yourself with a tone that nurtures the world inside you instead of damaging it. When you begin offering yourself the kind of steady, nourishing inner presence you never had as a child, something delicate starts to shift. The younger parts of you soften. The fear loosens its grip. The old wounds stop screaming as loudly. But when this healing begins, another presence often rises, the harsh narrator. The voice that believes toughness is the only way to stay in control. The voice that thinks kindness is weakness. The voice that has been running the show for years through criticism, pressure, and fear. When you start reparenting yourself, this voice feels threatened. It pushes harder. It speaks louder. And this is the moment when one of the most powerful Buddhist practices becomes essential. Inner metta, loving kindness directed toward yourself as medicine for the mind's harshest voice. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from the ego's narrator. It's the pain of hearing, "You're not enough. You should do better. No one else struggles like this. You're falling behind. You don't deserve rest. You are too much. You are not lovable." These lines feel authoritative because you've heard them inside for so long. They carry the tone of certainty. They try to convince you that they are telling the truth. But they are not truth. They are habit. Inner metta is the antidote to that habit. It does not fight the critic. It does not argue with it. It does not try to prove it wrong. It uses a softer, more powerful approach, dissolving the inner critic's authority by surrounding the mind with loving kindness, until the harshness can no longer stand on its own. Loving-kindness phrases are simple, short, bare, but the simplicity is the point. They slip beneath the critic's defenses. They bypass the ego's arguments. They send warmth into places logic cannot reach. They are not strategies, they are nourishment. And when the mind is nourished, the critic loses its power. Inner metta begins with the willingness to speak to yourself as someone who deserves care. That alone can feel unsettling if you are used to motivating yourself through pressure. But metta works slowly, gently, consistently. Its strength comes not from force, but from repetition. Each phrase is like a drop of warmth falling onto a cold surface. One drop does little, but thousands reshape the entire landscape. One of the core reasons metta dismantles the critic is because the critic feeds on tension. It grows stronger when you are stressed, tired, ashamed, or overwhelmed. Metta softens those states. A softened mind is harder to hurt. When you say inwardly, "May I be safe," something inside relaxes. When you say, "May I be kind to myself," the chest loosens. When you say, "May I accept myself as I am," the breath deepens. These internal shifts weaken the critic's foundation. Loving-kindness phrases also introduce a new emotional tone. The critic operates through harshness. Metta operates through tenderness. When you repeat these phrases, you start building a new emotional atmosphere. At first, it feels foreign. Your critic says, "This is silly." But over time, the tone becomes familiar. Eventually, it becomes the default. The critic loses dominance because the mind prefers warmth. Metta also challenges the critic by offering unconditional goodwill. The critic only speaks in conditions. You're worthy if, you're safe when, you're lovable after. Metta ignores all conditions. It speaks as if worthiness is already present, as if safety is already deserved. This unconditional quality confuses the critic. It cannot negotiate with unconditional love. It cannot argue with kindness that expects nothing in return. Another way metta weakens the critic is by creating a new voice in your inner world, not a voice of logic, but a voice of empathy. This new voice becomes steady through repetition. The critic may shout, but love speaks consistently, and consistency is stronger than volume. The more often you repeat metta phrases, the more rooted this new voice becomes. Eventually, the critic becomes background noise instead of the main narrator. Metta phrases also reshape how the mind interprets experience. The critic sees mistakes as evidence of failure. Metta sees mistakes as part of being human. The critic sees vulnerability as danger. Metta sees vulnerability as tenderness. The critic sees emotions as problems. Metta sees emotions as waves passing through. These interpretations become emotional habits. When metta is practiced regularly, the mind naturally leans toward gentler interpretations. This reconditioning makes it harder for the critic to manipulate your emotions. Metta also helps dissolve the internalized voices of the past. Many harsh inner lines were absorbed from caregivers who did not know how to speak with compassion. Metta disrupts this inheritance. When you say, "May I be protected," you are giving yourself what you once lacked. When you say, "May I be patient with my own tenderness," you erase decades of emotional dismissal. When you say, "May I care for my own suffering," you step out of old karmic patterns and into conscious choice. Loving kindness also addresses the root of the critic, fear. The critic attacks because it believes punishment prevents failure. It believes harshness will keep you in line. It believes pressure is the only safe path. Metta speaks directly to that fear. When you say, "May I feel supported," the body calms. When you say, "May I be gentle with myself," the inner tension softens. The critic loses its fuel. Fear dissolves not through force, but through warmth. Metta gives you the courage to step away from fear-based self-talk. Metta also creates space in the mind. The critic compresses everything. It closes, it tightens, it collapses. Loving kindness opens, it widens, it breathes. This space is essential. In a spacious mind, the critic's voice becomes smaller. It becomes one voice among many, not the ruler of the internal world. Space is not emptiness, it is freedom. The practice of inner metta is especially powerful because it requires no belief. You do not need to feel kind to yourself before practicing it. You simply repeat the phrases with sincerity. The feelings grow over time. Even if the words feel mechanical, they still plant seeds. Those seeds grow into emotional warmth. That warmth becomes strength. Another reason metta works so deeply is because loving kindness is aligned with your true nature. The harsh critic is a learned pattern. It is a construction. It is artificial. But metta speaks to the part of you that is untouched by fear, shame, or conditioning. It speaks to the part of you that naturally knows how to care. When you repeat phrases of kindness, you are reconnecting with something already inside you. The critic is loud, but it is not you. Loving kindness is quiet, but it is real. Metta also helps you untangle self-worth from achievement. The critic ties your worth to performance. Loving kindness speaks to your worth as a human being. When you say, "May I be peaceful," you are not asking for perfection. You are asking for ease. When you say, "May I love myself as I am," you are stepping outside the critic's system of measurement. Worth becomes inherent, not earned. As you keep practicing inner metta, you develop a new internal reflex. When the critic attacks, your first response becomes kindness instead of collapse. When shame rises, you meet it with warmth. When fear surges, you meet it with reassurance. The mind learns that kindness is the default. This is not weakness. This is mastery. Metta also rewrites how you handle disappointment. The critic treats disappointment as a sign of failure. Loving kindness treats disappointment as a moment to comfort yourself. This shift keeps the heart open during hard times. When the heart stays open, you respond with wisdom instead of panic. Another layer of loving kindness is compassion for your own suffering. When you say, "May I hold my pain with tenderness," you acknowledge your suffering without drowning in it. You become both the one who feels the pain and the one who offers comfort. This dual awareness stabilizes the mind. It stops the critic from isolating you inside your own fear. Metta also supports emotional regulation. Harsh self-talk increases emotional intensity. Loving kindness reduces it. This is because metta calms the nervous system. It reduces fight or flight reactions. It lowers inner resistance. When the body calms, the critic loses its grip. The mind becomes more balanced, making wise choices easier. One of the most profound effects of inner metta is the transformation of self-identity. The critic tells you who you are in the worst way. Metta shows you who you could be in the best way. When you repeatedly speak phrases like, "May I be free from inner harm," you begin to see yourself as someone worthy of protection. When you say, "May I be gentle with my mistakes," you begin to see yourself as someone capable of growth without fear. This identity shift is not theoretical, it is lived. Metta also helps you forgive yourself. Not forgiveness as erasing the past, but forgiveness as releasing the emotional chains that keep you stuck in regret. The critic clings to old mistakes. Loving kindness loosens them. When you say, "May I be free from unnecessary guilt," you are telling the critic that its job is done. Its grip releases. Eventually, metta creates a deep inner loyalty to yourself. A loyalty that makes you stop abandoning yourself when life gets hard. A loyalty that makes you stop speaking to yourself like an enemy. A loyalty that makes you choose kindness, even when the critic demands cruelty. This loyalty becomes a foundation you can stand on. And over time, the harsh narrator becomes quieter, not because you defeated it, but because you stopped believing it. Loving kindness becomes your inner language. Warmth becomes your inner climate. Compassion becomes your inner truth. And from that truth, a new way of living arises. One that feels clearer, softer, and far more human. When loving kindness becomes the tone of your inner world, something deeper begins to loosen. Something that has been quietly holding your suffering in place for years. The harsh narrator starts losing its authority, and in the space it leaves behind, you begin to feel a strange softness, a lightness you didn't expect. It almost feels like a doorway you've passed without realizing it. And on the other side of that doorway is one of the most liberating truths in Buddhism. The self you speak to is not fixed, solid, or permanent. The you your inner critic attacks is always changing, always shifting, never the same from moment to moment. Once you understand this, compassion starts to grow naturally. Because how can you blame a self that is constantly disappearing and becoming new? There is something quietly transformative about realizing you are not a fixed identity. Most people speak to themselves as if they are carved in stone. "I always do this. I'll never change. This is just who I am." These statements feel heavy because they freeze your entire being into a single moment, a single behavior, a single emotion. But anatta, the Buddhist teaching of no fixed self, reveals something very different. It shows that the you who felt ashamed yesterday is not the same you reading this right now. The you who made a mistake last year does not exist anymore. The mind, the body, the emotions, the beliefs, all of them shift constantly. Nothing stays the same long enough to deserve permanent blame. Speaking to yourself from this understanding changes everything. Instead of telling yourself, "I am bad," you see that a moment of confusion happened. Instead of saying, "I am weak," you see that a moment of fear arose. Instead of saying, "I am broken," you see that pain pass through your experience. This perspective doesn't erase responsibility. It releases the unnecessary weight of self-condemnation. You stop defining yourself by temporary states, and compassion naturally replaces judgment. When you realize there is no solid self to attack, the inner critic loses its main target. Harsh thoughts feel less convincing because they rely on the belief that you are one single unchanging being. Without that belief, the critic's voice collapses. The statements, "you always fail" or "you never improve," sound false because they depend on a fixed identity. Anatta exposes these thoughts as illusions. Once the illusion breaks, the blame loses its foundation. This understanding also helps you step out of old emotional patterns. When anger rises, you no longer think, "I'm an angry person." You think, "Anger is here." When fear appears, you no longer think, "I'm a coward." You think, "Fear is passing through." This shift removes shame from your emotions. It lets you experience them without turning them into self-attacks. The moment you stop identifying with your emotions, compassion appears naturally. You stop punishing yourself for feeling human. Seeing the self as impermanent also softens regret. Regret thrives on the belief that a past version of you should have known better. But that past version had different knowledge, different wounds, different tools. They could not act with the wisdom you have now. When you say, "I should have done better," you're judging a version of yourself that no longer exists with the awareness you gained later. This is unfair to your own journey. The moment you understand this, regret loosens and compassion flows in its place. Another layer of this teaching affects how you talk to yourself after mistakes. When you believe you are fixed, mistakes feel like proof of who you are. But when you understand impermanence, mistakes become moments of learning. You stop saying, "I ruined everything," and start saying, "Something didn't work, I can adjust." You stop attacking yourself for not being perfect and start supporting yourself through growth. This shift transforms your entire relationship with failure. You stop fearing it because it no longer threatens your identity. Understanding impermanence also changes how you relate to shame. Shame attaches itself to a belief in a constant self. "I am shameful." But if the self is changing, then shame cannot define you. It becomes an event rather than a character trait. When shame loses its grip, self-kindness becomes easier. You stop treating yourself as a problem to fix and start seeing yourself as a being passing through a very human experience. There is also a deep emotional relief in realizing that you don't have to carry the weight of past identities. Every time you outgrow a version of yourself, you are free to release the story that came with it. You don't owe loyalty to your old patterns. You don't have to keep punishing yourself for actions taken by a person who no longer exists. This is not avoidance. It is clarity. It is the freedom to evolve without dragging chains behind you. When you apply this understanding to self-talk, your inner language becomes gentler. Instead of rigid labels, you use descriptions. Instead of accusations, you use observations. Instead of permanent judgments, you use temporary acknowledgements. You learn to say, "This is what I'm feeling now," rather than, "This is who I am." This small difference in wording reshapes the emotional tone of your mind. It removes violence and adds humanity. Impermanence also teaches you not to cling to your worst moments. Painful thoughts, embarrassing memories, difficult emotions, they rise and fall like everything else. When you say to yourself, "This won't last," you create space. You stop gripping the moment so tightly. You stop adding the second arrow. You allow the discomfort to pass. The mind becomes less reactive because it trusts that everything moves. This teaching also shifts the way you handle identity struggles. Many people carry rigid self-concepts. "I'm not good at relationships. I can't handle stress. I always shut down. I'm too sensitive. I'm too damaged." These beliefs feel like facts, but they are simply interpretations of past patterns. When you understand anatta, you realize these identities are not destiny. They were temporary adaptations. You do not have to keep repeating them. You can speak to yourself as someone capable of new patterns, new choices, new responses. Another powerful result of this understanding is the rise of patience. If the self is always changing, then growth is not a straight line. It is a series of waves, progress, confusion, steps forward, steps back. When you recognize this, you stop attacking yourself for not improving fast enough. You stop demanding constant progress. You stop seeing setbacks as failures. You speak to yourself with the same patience a wise teacher gives a student learning something new. Compassion becomes the natural response. Impermanence also dissolves envy and insecurity. When you believe you are fixed, you compare yourself to others as if the comparison is permanent. But when you see that everyone is changing, growing, struggling, and evolving, comparison becomes gentler. You understand that everyone is in motion, including you. You stop punishing yourself for not matching someone's temporary moment. One of the deepest gifts of this teaching is that it frees you from defining yourself by your suffering. Painful emotions come and go. Traumas rise and fall. Old wounds surface and fade. They do not define you. They shape you for a moment, then shift. When you talk to yourself with this understanding, you stop saying, "This is who I am," and start saying, "This is what I'm carrying right now." That shift alone creates compassion. When you realize there is no solid you, self-blame becomes harder to maintain. Who exactly are you blaming? A past version, a momentary impulse, a temporary emotion, a nervous system response shaped by years of conditioning? This perspective does not dismiss responsibility. It dissolves unnecessary cruelty. You start holding yourself accountable without punishing yourself. You take responsibility without shame. You grow without fear. Speaking to the impermanent self also opens your heart to forgiveness. Not forgiveness as forgetting, but forgiveness as releasing yourself from identifying with your past. When you realize the person who suffered is not the same as the one standing here now, forgiveness becomes possible. You stop dragging the old self into the new moment. You stop freezing your identity in your worst memories. You start treating yourself with mercy. This understanding also cultivates humility. If the self is always changing, then you don't need to cling to being right, strong, perfect, or certain. You can soften. You can admit you don't know. You can let yourself learn. You can grow without shame. Humility opens the door to growth because it removes the ego's need for rigid identity. Without that rigidity, your inner speech becomes kinder, gentler, and more honest. Over time, speaking to the impermanent self becomes natural. You no longer talk to yourself as a fixed thing. You speak to the present experience. You speak to the present emotion. You speak to the present need. Your inner voice becomes fluid, responsive, compassionate. The critic loses its foundation. Blame dissolves. Shame fades. Compassion becomes your inner default, not because you forced it, but because reality revealed itself. There is no solid self to attack. When you understand this deeply, a new kind of freedom appears. You stop carrying old versions of yourself. You stop attacking a self that isn't real. And in that space of release, compassion fills the silence, steady, warm, and endlessly human. When you begin speaking to yourself as an impermanent being, shifting, unfolding, never frozen in any single identity, a deeper tenderness naturally rises. A softness that does not need permission. A warmth that does not need perfection. And in that softness, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. You have always known how to offer compassion to others. You have always known how to comfort, how to understand, how to forgive, how to extend kindness without hesitation. But when it comes to yourself, that same compassion suddenly feels out of reach, as if you are the only being on earth not deserving of the care you freely give. This silent contradiction is where the next part of the path begins, learning the Bodhisattva's self-compassion, offering yourself the same care you would offer any suffering being. There is something heartbreaking about realizing that many people can easily comfort a friend, but collapse when offering comfort to themselves. They will sit with someone else's tears, but shame themselves for their own. They will forgive another person's mistake, but torment themselves for days over a moment of humanity. This double standard does not come from malice. It comes from conditioning. Many grew up believing compassion must always go outward, never inward. That self-care is selfish. That self-forgiveness is weakness. That their own suffering must be minimized because others have it worse. Yet compassion does not work like a limited resource. It does not diminish when used on yourself. In fact, the more you include yourself in compassion, the more freely compassion flows outward. A bodhisattva is someone committed to the liberation of all beings, but that word all includes you. People forget this. They picture compassion as something they pour from an emptying cup, giving everything away while leaving nothing for themselves. They do not realize that compassion grows when shared, not when hoarded. When you offer compassion outward but refuse to receive it inward, the flow becomes blocked. Exhaustion appears, resentment appears, quiet bitterness appears. Your heart closes slowly because you are giving from depletion instead of fullness. True bodhisattva compassion is circular. It moves outward and inward with no break in the movement. Self-compassion nourishes the heart that offers compassion to others. Without inner compassion, outer compassion becomes performance, obligation, or self-erasure. With inner compassion, outer compassion becomes effortless, sustainable, and genuine. The first step in including yourself in compassion is noticing how quickly you exclude yourself. When someone else suffers, you may immediately think, they deserve kindness. But when you suffer, the first thought might be, I should handle this better, or I shouldn't feel this way, or I caused this. This reflexive self-exclusion is a learned pattern. You learn to place yourself outside the circle of compassion. You learn to treat your suffering as an inconvenience. The Bodhisattva path asks you to bring yourself back into the circle, not as the center, not as the exception, but as one of the many beings deserving of care. Another reason people exclude themselves from compassion is fear. Fear that being gentle with themselves will make them weak. Fear that self-forgiveness will lead to irresponsibility. Fear that self-kindness will dissolve discipline. But compassion does not weaken effort. It strengthens it. When someone speaks to themselves with warmth, they become more resilient, not less. They recover faster from mistakes. They learn without shame. They grow without fear. Self-compassion sharpens wisdom because it removes the emotional fog created by self-judgment. Compassion toward yourself also allows you to see your own suffering clearly. Many people minimize their pain because they believe acknowledging it makes them selfish. But the Bodhisattva sees suffering with honesty. When you deny your pain, it does not disappear. It moves underground, shaping your reactions, your choices, and your relationships in ways you cannot see. Self-compassion brings that suffering into the light without shame. It says, "This hurts. Let me care for it." That simple internal gesture can prevent years of hidden struggle. Self-compassion also breaks the cycle of inner scarcity. When you believe compassion is something you do not deserve, you begin living in emotional hunger. You offer compassion outward, hoping someone will give it back to you, knowing deep down you will not allow yourself to receive it. This creates quiet pain, a sense of emptiness, a longing that cannot be fulfilled because you are the one blocking the door. Self-compassion opens that door. It allows you to receive the kindness you have been waiting for, from yourself. One of the deepest aspects of Bodhisattva compassion is seeing all beings as equal in their longing for relief from suffering. This includes the part of you that feels broken, ashamed, or lost. That part does not need your judgment. It needs your kindness. When you talk to yourself in a compassionate tone, you treat your inner suffering the same way you would treat another person's suffering, with gentleness, not criticism. This inner equality is essential. Without it, your compassion becomes selective. With it, compassion becomes unconditional. Self-compassion also changes the way you hold responsibility. Many people treat responsibility as punishment. They believe the only way to avoid mistakes is through inner attack. But responsibility is clearest when held with compassion. When you treat yourself with kindness, you can see your choices more clearly. You can admit mistakes without defensiveness. You can change your behavior without hating yourself. Compassion does not remove responsibility. It makes responsibility workable. Another important layer is recognizing that your suffering is not unique in its structure. Pain, regret, fear, longing, confusion. These experiences appear in every human life. Seeing this universality softens your self-judgment. You stop blaming yourself for being human. You stop expecting yourself to rise above emotions no one else escapes. This shared humanity is the foundation of compassion. When you see your suffering as part of the human condition, compassion flows naturally toward yourself. Self-compassion also builds emotional stability. When you treat yourself kindly, you create an inner refuge, a place you can return to when life becomes overwhelming. Many people do not have this refuge. Their inner world feels hostile. When something goes wrong, they attack themselves instead of supporting themselves. This doubles suffering. The Bodhisattva path encourages you to become your own refuge. When you speak to yourself with compassion, you slowly create an inner environment where your mind feels safe. Compassion toward yourself also prevents burnout. You cannot carry the suffering of others if you cannot hold your own with tenderness. Compassion fatigue is not caused by giving too much. It is caused by giving without receiving inwardly. When you include yourself in the circle of compassion, you replenish the heart that gives. You protect your capacity to care. Compassion becomes renewable rather than draining. Self-compassion also transforms the way you relate to your mistakes. Instead of treating them as evidence of unworthiness, you treat them as opportunities for gentle correction. A bodhisattva does not shame themselves for their imperfections. They recognize imperfection as part of the path. When you say to yourself, "I made a mistake and I can learn," you respond with wisdom rather than self-attack. This supports growth without emotional damage. Including yourself in compassion also allows you to show up more fully for others. When you are harsh inside, you subtly resent the compassion you give. A part of you feels unseen, uncared for, forgotten. This creates quiet resentment. When you begin offering compassion inwardly, that resentment dissolves. You no longer give from emptiness. You give from fullness, stability, and genuine presence. Self-compassion also helps you understand others more deeply. When you see your own suffering clearly, you recognize the suffering of others with more accuracy. You no longer judge their pain as weakness. You no longer expect them to rise above their conditioning instantly. You see humanity in them because you finally see it in yourself. This deepens your relationships and increases your capacity for true empathy. The Bodhisattva's compassion includes understanding your own limits. Many people harm themselves by pushing beyond what their body or mind can hold. They ignore exhaustion. They ignore emotional strain. They ignore signs of burnout. Self-compassion teaches you to honor your limits as sacred, to rest when needed, to say no when overwhelmed, to protect your well-being without guilt. This is not selfish. It is wisdom. A depleted person cannot serve anyone. Finally, self-compassion connects you with the truth that you too are a being on the path. You are not above or below anyone else. You are learning, you are growing, you are healing, you are making your way through the world with the tools you have, just like every other person. When you see yourself this way, compassion toward yourself becomes natural, not forced, not practiced, natural. When you finally allow yourself to be included in the circle of compassion, something subtle starts to unfold in the background. Your self-talk becomes warmer, your inner tone becomes softer, your reactions become slower, steadier, more spacious, and in that new spaciousness, you begin to notice something profound. Not every thought deserves a reply. Not every inner disturbance needs a lecture, a correction, or a comforting message. Sometimes the most loving thing you can offer yourself is silence. Not the cold silence of withdrawal, but the gentle silence of awareness. A silence that leaves room for your experience to breathe without pressure, without judgment, without interference. There is a kind of suffering that grows stronger when you argue with it. When negative thoughts appear, the instinct is to answer them, fix them, push them away, or layer new thoughts on top of them. But the more you fight with them, the louder they become. The more you try to solve them, the deeper they embed themselves. You end up in an internal conversation that exhausts you without creating any peace. This is because suffering fed by engagement grows. Suffering met with spacious awareness fades. Silence becomes a loving response when you realize you do not need to win against your thoughts. You do not need to compete with them. You do not need to correct every harsh sentence that appears in your mind. You simply need to step out of the struggle. Negative thoughts are not commands. They are not truths. They are not instructions. They are events in consciousness, passing, shifting, dissolving on their own when not fueled by attention. Silence gives them nothing to push against. This kind of silence is not emptiness, it is presence. A gentle presence that watches thoughts come and go without identifying with them. When you respond to your own suffering with this quiet awareness, you create a refuge inside yourself. A place where you are no longer drowning in your thoughts, but witnessing them from a place that is untouched by their noise. One reason silence is so powerful is because suffering often grows from reaction. A painful memory surfaces and the mind reacts with panic. a self-critical thought rises, and the mind reacts with resistance. A fear appears, and the mind reacts with judgment. Each reaction tightens the knot. Each reaction adds another arrow. When you respond with silence, you interrupt this chain. You stop giving the suffering anything to cling to. You stop adding friction. This does not mean ignoring your pain. Ignoring is another form of resistance. Loving silence means allowing your pain to exist without fighting it and without drowning in it. You let it breathe. You give it space. And space transforms suffering more gently than any argument ever could. Silence also teaches you something essential. You are not your thoughts. When you sit in quiet awareness, you begin to notice the gap between the observer and the observed. Thoughts appear and disappear, while something deeper in you remains still. That stillness is who you are beneath the noise. When you rest in that stillness, negative thoughts lose their authority. They are no longer a storm surrounding you. They are clouds drifting through a sky that cannot be harmed. This recognition softens self-judgment. When a harsh thought arises, instead of saying, "This must mean something about me," you begin to say, "This is just a passing mental event." That alone dissolves so much unnecessary suffering. The thought loses its ability to define you. It becomes light instead of heavy, temporary instead of eternal. Silence also protects you from believing the stories your mind creates when you are tired, stressed, or overwhelmed. In those moments, your thoughts are rarely accurate. They are colored by emotion. They are shaped by old wounds. They rise from fear rather than clarity. Responding to them with silence prevents you from making them more real than they are. It keeps you from feeding illusions. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for yourself is to stop arguing with your own pain, to stop trying to fix yourself in every moment, to stop treating every thought as a problem that needs immediate attention. Silence teaches you to trust that not every wave needs to be fought. Some waves simply need to pass. Another reason silence is healing is because the mind often uses words to attack itself. Words are the critic's weapons. When you stop speaking back, even kindly, you take away the battlefield. The critic has nothing to fight. It loses momentum. It fades out of habit. Your silence becomes stronger than its noise. Over time, the critic becomes weaker, not because you defeated it, but because you stopped participating in its game. Silence is also a form of deep respect for your inner world. It acknowledges that your experience deserves room to unfold naturally. When a difficult feeling arises, silence tells that feeling, "You are allowed to be here." That acceptance alone can dissolve tension. So much of suffering is caused by the belief that certain inner states are unacceptable. Silence removes that belief. It lets the mind move without interference. This silence is not passive. It is intentional. It is full of awareness. It is the choice to stay present without forcing yourself to feel differently. For many people, this is the first time they have ever been allowed to feel without pressure. This alone can begin to heal childhood wounds where emotions were met with dismissal, correction, or punishment. Silence also allows wisdom to emerge. When the mind stops reacting, deeper understanding rises naturally. Insight does not appear in noise. Insight appears in stillness. When you stop answering your thoughts and simply observe them, patterns become clear. You see which thoughts arise from fear, which arise from habits, which arise from outdated identities. You learn to differentiate between temporary mental weather and deeper truth. This clarity grows only in silence. Loving silence is especially powerful during moments of shame. Shame thrives on internal debate. It grows when you argue with it. It grows when you cling to it. It grows when you try to push it away. But when you meet shame with silence, something surprising happens. It weakens. Shame expects attack or collapse. When neither appears, shame has nothing to anchor into. It becomes something you can observe instead of something you drown in. Silence is also a refuge during anxiety. Anxious thoughts multiply when you chase them. Silence breaks the cycle by refusing to chase. You breathe, you sink into awareness. You let the anxious thought run its course without trying to control it. The nervous system begins to settle because there is no added resistance, no internal argument, no pressure to make the anxiety stop. The body responds to silence as safety. Sometimes silence is the only response that feels true. If you try to force positive thoughts when you feel deeply hurt, they can feel fake. If you try to rationalize your emotions in the middle of chaos, the mind can feel overwhelmed. Silence allows you to be honest. You don't need to fake strength. You don't need to pretend clarity. You don't need to say anything to yourself at all. You simply stay with yourself. That alone is deep compassion. Silence also honors the mystery of your inner world. Not everything needs to be explained or solved. Some pain needs time, not answers. Some emotions need space, not correction. Silence is a kind of trust. Trust in your own capacity to endure, to heal, to transform without forcing the process. This kind of silence also builds self-respect. When you stop reacting to every inner disturbance, you stop being controlled by your thoughts. You begin to trust yourself. You begin to stand more firmly. You begin to feel less fragile. The mind becomes a place where you are not constantly pulled by every passing emotion. You find a center inside yourself, a place of quiet strength. Loving silence also helps you navigate the intensity of your own sensitivity. Many people are overwhelmed not because their emotions are too strong, but because they never learned to sit in silence with themselves. They were taught to respond, fix, talk, explain, push. Silence gives them a new way to be with their inner experience, one that does not require effort. As you practice this, you begin to see that silence is not empty. It is full of space, full of possibility, full of the freedom to breathe, full of the permission to be human without needing to justify your existence. Silence is an act of love because it holds you gently. It does not push you to be different. It does not demand immediate transformation. It simply sits with you like a true friend, a presence that stays even when you have nothing to say. And in that presence, your suffering begins to soften on its own, not through force, but through the healing nature of spacious awareness. When you learn to meet your own suffering with silence instead of inner violence, the mind becomes calmer, clearer, more honest. You stop feeding the storms inside you. You stop adding pressure to pain. And in that quiet, another truth rises to the surface. Your self-talk doesn't just need to be gentle. It also needs to be balanced. Because a mind that used to attack itself can sometimes swing to the other extreme. It can start avoiding responsibility. It can start inflating itself with empty affirmations. It can start using positivity as an escape rather than a truth. And now, the path asks for something subtler, the middle way of self-talk, where your inner voice is neither harsh nor delusional, neither punishing nor flattering, but steady, honest, and rooted in clear seeing. There is a danger hidden in both extremes. Harsh self-talk crushes your spirit, makes you small, and traps you in fear. Delusional self-praise inflates the ego, blinds you to your own patterns, and disconnects you from reality. Both forms of speech distort the truth. Both forms block growth. The middle way requires you to speak to yourself with kindness, yes, but also with clarity. Compassion without honesty leads to denial. Honesty without compassion leads to self-harm. The art is holding both at the same time. Balanced self-talk begins with acknowledging your humanity. Not perfect, not broken, simply human. You recognize your strengths without inflating them. You acknowledge your mistakes without attacking your worth. You allow yourself to grow without expecting instant transformation. This balance is delicate. It requires you to stay grounded, to stay awake, to stay deeply connected to what is real instead of what you fear or what you wish. One of the biggest traps in self-talk is swinging between extremes when emotions run high. After years of harshness, people sometimes try to compensate by flooding themselves with exaggerated positivity. They tell themselves, "I'm amazing. I can do anything. Everything is perfect," even when they don't believe it. These phrases don't support healing. They create a gap between your inner world and reality. You feel the distance. You sense the dishonesty. And when reality challenges those statements, you collapse again. The middle way avoids this trap by grounding self-talk in truth. Instead of saying, "I'm perfect," which the mind rejects, you say, "I'm learning." Instead of saying, "Everything will work out exactly how I want," you say, "I will face whatever comes with strength." Instead of saying, "I never fail," you say, "I can recover from failure." These statements are both kind and true. The mind trusts them. They don't inflate your ego. They support your growth. Balanced self-talk also involves recognizing your capabilities without turning them into rigid identities. The ego loves to latch onto labels like strong, smart, successful, talented. But when your identity becomes tied to these labels, you begin fearing anything that threatens them. The middle way encourages you to speak to yourself with appreciation without turning appreciation into identity. You can say, "I handled that well," without turning it into, "I am always strong." You can say, "I was patient today," without turning it into, "I never lose my temper." This flexibility prevents the ego from using positive self-talk to build walls. Another crucial part of the middle way is admitting your limits without shame. Many people believe that acknowledging their weaknesses means betraying themselves. They fear it means going backward into self-hatred. But the middle way teaches that weakness is simply part of the human experience. When you say to yourself, "This is an area where I struggle," without attacking yourself, you open a door for growth. Harshness closes that door. Delusion blinds you to the door altogether. Balance lets you walk through it. The middle way also helps you avoid spiritual bypassing. Sometimes people use gentle self-talk to avoid uncomfortable emotions. They cover sadness with forced positivity. They cover anger with fake calm. They cover fear with empty affirmations. But this is not compassion. It is avoidance. The middle way encourages you to acknowledge emotions honestly. I'm hurting right now. I'm scared, and that's okay. This anger has something to teach me. These statements neither shame nor deny your feelings. They hold them with clarity. Balanced self-talk also changes how you relate to effort. Harshness says, "Do more or you're worthless." Delusion says, "I don't need to try at all. I'm already perfect." The middle way says, "I will do my best, and my best will change from day to day." This approach keeps you motivated without overwhelming you. It respects both your goals and your humanity. The middle way of self-talk also protects you from ego-based self-esteem. Ego-based esteem rises when you perform well and collapses when you stumble. It depends on achievement, comparison, and approval. The middle way builds a different kind of esteem, one rooted in your intrinsic worth. When you speak to yourself kindly and truthfully, your confidence no longer rests on external success. It rests on the steady relationship you have with yourself. This confidence does not crumble under pressure because it was never built on illusion. Balanced self-talk also involves recognizing when the mind is exaggerating. The mind loves extremes. I ruined everything. Nobody cares. I will never get better. This always happens. The middle way helps you catch these distortions. Instead of blindly believing them, you respond with grounded clarity. This is one moment, not my whole life. I'm overwhelmed, not hopeless. This didn't go well, but I can learn from it. This doesn't sugarcoat reality. It corrects distortion without cruelty. Another essential part of the middle way is speaking to yourself respectfully, even when you are correcting yourself. Many people only know how to motivate themselves through pressure or shame. They believe compassion makes them lazy, but the middle way shows that respect is a more effective teacher than punishment. You can say, "I could have handled that differently," without saying, "I'm terrible." You can say, "I want to improve this behavior," without saying, "I'm flawed." Respect-based correction supports change without damaging your self-worth. Balanced self-talk also prevents self-centered positivity. Some people misuse self-kindness by inflating themselves above others. They turn compassion into superiority. The middle way keeps compassion grounded by reminding you that your worth is equal to others, not higher, not lower. This prevents self-talk from becoming ego reinforcement. It keeps kindness humble. It keeps confidence soft. It keeps self-acceptance from turning into self-importance. The middle way also teaches you to separate your behavior from your identity. When you believe your actions define your entire worth, every mistake becomes catastrophic. Balanced self-talk separates the two. I made a mistake, but I am not a mistake. This separation allows you to take responsibility without drowning in shame. It allows growth without self-hatred. Another aspect of balanced inner speech is recognizing when self-praise becomes escapism. Saying, "I'm amazing," during a moment when you need accountability can block growth. But saying, "I'm capable of doing better," invites both self-respect and self-honesty. Balanced praise supports effort without inflating the ego. It encourages courage without creating arrogance. The middle way also helps you face your flaws with gentleness. A balanced inner voice can say, "This is something I need to work on," with the same warmth you would offer a friend. It does not hide your flaws. It does not obsess over them. It acknowledges them as part of your path. This allows you to approach self-improvement with curiosity instead of dread. Balanced self-talk also supports emotional maturity. It keeps you from reacting to every mood as if it defines you. When sadness rises, you do not say, "I'm broken." When anger rises, you do not say, "I'm dangerous." When fear rises, you do not say, "I'm weak." Instead, you say, "This is a passing state." This clarity keeps emotions from becoming identities. The middle way also protects you from overconfidence. Confidence built on delusion collapses when challenged. Confidence built on grounded truth remains steady. When you tell yourself, "I can handle challenges because I have before," you build strength rooted in experience. When you say, "I am always right," you build ego. The middle way keeps you humble and strong at the same time. Balanced self-talk is not about being neutral or emotionless. It is about being accurate. It is about being kind and honest at the same time. It is about speaking to yourself in a way that supports reality, not fantasy or fear. It is the voice of a wise guide inside you, not a punishing critic, not a flattering cheerleader, but a steady companion. When you walk this middle path, your inner world becomes stable. Your mind becomes trustworthy. Your heart becomes grounded. You stop living in extremes. You stop swinging between tearing yourself down and building yourself up artificially. Instead, you live in a space where growth is natural, compassion is steady, and truth is gentle. When you learn to walk the middle path inside your own mind, neither attacking yourself nor inflating yourself, you start to notice something even subtler beneath the surface. You begin to see that many painful thoughts never start as thoughts at all. They start as sensations: tightening, heaviness, heat in the chest, pressure behind the eyes, a sinking feeling in the stomach. These sensations arise long before the mind finds words for them. And once the mind does find words, those words often turn sharp, judgmental, or fearful. By the time the inner critic speaks, the emotional energy has already built up. So now, the path invites you even deeper, to catch your suffering before language forms and to meet those early signals with compassion so they never harden into negative self-talk. There is a whole world inside you that exists before thought. A world made of vibrations, impulses, and emotional movements. Most people only react once words appear. "I can't handle this. Something's wrong with me. I'm anxious again." But by the time these sentences show up, the emotional energy has already shaped them. Pre-verbal self-compassion means working not with the words, but with the energy underneath them. It means caring for the discomfort at its earliest stage, before the mind turns it into a story that hurts you. This kind of compassion begins with noticing. Noticing the moment your chest tightens before your mind labels it as fear. Noticing the flutter of tension before the mind says, "I'm stressed." Noticing the hollow drop in your stomach before the mind says, "I failed." These sensations are the raw material of emotion. They are innocent. They are not yet judgments. They are simply the body communicating that something needs attention. Most inner suffering happens because we ignore these early signals. We rush past them. We judge them. We drown them in distraction. And when we avoid them, they intensify. The body speaks louder, the mind takes over, and the words that come next are almost always harsh. But when you learn to meet these early sensations with compassion, the entire emotional process changes. Pre-verbal compassion is the art of responding to sensations with warmth before the critic arrives. When the chest tightens, instead of thinking, "What's wrong with me?" you place your awareness gently there and inwardly whisper, "It's okay. I feel this. I'm here." The moment you do this, the emotional energy begins to soften. The mind becomes less reactive. The words that would have followed lose their force. This is not mystical. It is biological. When you respond with compassion at the sensation level, your nervous system receives a message of safety. The fight or flight response begins to settle. The breath deepens. The body comes out of survival mode, and when the body feels safe, the mind stops creating harsh interpretations. Working at this pre-verbal stage also prevents emotional spiraling. Negative thoughts often appear not because the situation is bad, but because the body is tense. The mind creates stories to explain sensations. If the body feels tight, the mind says, "I'm overwhelmed." If the stomach drops, the mind says, "I'm not enough." Pre-verbal compassion interrupts this pattern. By soothing the sensation first, the mind has nothing painful to interpret. Another layer of pre-verbal compassion is learning to stay with emotion without forcing it to go away. Many people panic when uncomfortable sensations arise. They think the discomfort itself is the problem, but emotions only grow louder when resisted. When you stay with them gently, without rushing, without judging, you teach your body that it is allowed to feel. That permission alone reduces suffering. This practice also helps you understand emotions in their pure form. Before words distort them, emotions have a natural intelligence. Sadness pulls you inward to help you rest. Anger rises to help you protect a boundary. Fear appears to alert you to something important. Guilt shows you where your actions misaligned with your values. Every emotion has a function, but when you judge them immediately, you lose access to their wisdom. Pre-verbal compassion lets you feel the emotion directly without the critic interfering. This practice also strengthens your relationship with your inner child. Many early wounds show up first as sensations. A tight chest may be an echo of moments when you were shamed for crying. A sinking stomach may be an echo of moments when you were scolded for small mistakes. These sensations are not random. They are old emotional imprints resurfacing. When you meet them with compassion, you are giving your younger self the response it never received, gentle presence instead of punishment. Pre-verbal compassion also helps you stay in the present moment. Thought pulls you into past or future. Sensation exists only now. When you anchor your awareness in your body, you step out of the stories that fuel suffering. This grounding keeps your mind clear and prevents old conditioning from taking over. It gives you a stable foundation inside yourself. Working at this level also prevents emotional exhaustion. When you constantly respond to thoughts rather than sensations, you get caught in endless mental dialogue. You argue, analyze, justify, or criticize. This is exhausting. Pre-verbal compassion stops the cycle early. You conserve energy. You let the emotion move through the body naturally instead of fighting it with the mind. Another benefit is that you learn to trust your body. Many people are disconnected from their emotional sensations because they learned early in life that feelings were dangerous. They learned to suppress, to tighten, to numb. But your body is not your enemy. It is communicating with you. Pre-verbal compassion rebuilds that trust. You learn that sensations can be held without fear, that they pass, that they soften, that you can handle them. This trust creates emotional resilience. When you're no longer afraid of your own sensations, you can face difficult moments without collapsing. You can experience discomfort without creating panic. You can move through emotional storms while staying grounded. This resilience does not come from toughness. It comes from tenderness. Pre-verbal compassion also stops the formation of shame. Shame often arises when the mind interprets sensations as evidence of inadequacy. For example, when anxiety rises, the mind says, "I'm weak." When sadness rises, the mind says, "I'm too sensitive." When anger rises, the mind says, "I'm a bad person." These interpretations create shame, but when you meet sensations with compassion before words form, shame has no space to grow. You experience the emotion without turning it into a flaw. This practice also builds emotional clarity. When you sit with sensations, you begin to notice their texture. Some sensations mean sadness, some mean fear, some mean loneliness, some mean overstimulation. These feelings often get mislabeled as bad or wrong when they're simply human. Pre-verbal compassion teaches you how to identify emotions accurately. Accurate recognition is the foundation of emotional intelligence. Another essential aspect is learning to soothe the sensation directly. Sometimes the body needs warmth, sometimes it needs breath, sometimes it needs stillness, sometimes it needs movement. Pre-verbal compassion means listening to what the body truly needs, not what the critic thinks it should need. When you soothe the sensation directly, the emotion resolves without turning into negative thoughts. This also changes your relationship with anxiety. Anxiety is often a reaction to a sensation interpreted as danger. When you stop reacting to the sensation and instead offer compassion, "This feeling is intense, and I'm here," the fear response weakens. Over time, anxiety loses its power because your body learns that sensations are not threats. Pre-verbal compassion also helps you break long-standing emotional patterns. Many people repeat the same reactions because they never catch the emotion early enough. By the time they notice, the thought has already shaped the emotion into a familiar pattern. But when you learn to meet the earliest signals, you interrupt the pattern before it repeats. New emotional pathways form. Old habits loosen. Healing becomes possible. This practice is also deeply connected to mindfulness. Mindfulness is not about thinking calmly. It is about noticing what is present without judgment. Pre-verbal compassion brings mindfulness into the emotional body. It makes you aware of the first ripple of emotion instead of the full wave. This awareness prevents emotional overwhelm. It also teaches you a new way of relating to yourself. You stop seeing yourself as someone who must be managed or corrected. You see yourself as someone who can be held gently. This shift transforms your self-talk even before words arise. The inner world becomes less about performance and more about presence. Practicing pre-verbal compassion also opens you to deeper spiritual insight. You begin to see that emotions are not personal. They arise due to conditions. They move according to their nature. They dissolve when not fueled by resistance. This understanding softens your sense of self and deepens your compassion for all beings who struggle with the same human experience. Over time, this practice becomes natural. You begin noticing sensations before thoughts. You respond with warmth automatically. You stop engaging in inner battles. You trust the process of emotion rather than fearing it. You move through life with more ease because you are no longer ambushed by your own mind. And slowly, a new kind of self-talk emerges, not built from words, but from presence. A compassionate presence beneath thought, a quiet love beneath language, a tenderness that does not need to speak to be felt. The more you learn to meet your own emotions before they turn into words, the more you notice something unexpected rising in the background. Beneath the tension, beneath the shame, beneath the fear, there is a familiar voice that always seems to appear at the worst possible moment. The voice that criticizes, the voice that scolds, the voice that whispers, "You should be better, faster, stronger, quieter." And now, after every layer of awareness you've gained, that voice starts to look different. It no longer feels like pure aggression. It feels wounded. It feels tired. It feels scared. This is where the path gently turns. Instead of fighting the inner critic, you begin to see it as a suffering being inside you, one that needs compassion just as much as any frightened child. There is a deep shift that happens the moment you stop seeing your inner critic as an enemy. When you see it as an enemy, you resist it. You shout back. You try to silence it. But resistance feeds it. Silence enrages it. Fighting it gives it more presence. The critic grows stronger, not because it wants to harm you, but because it feels unheard, because it is trapped inside old fear, because it is repeating patterns from another time, another environment, another version of you. Seeing this changes everything. The inner critic is not cruel by nature. It is desperate. It is terrified of failure, terrified of shame, terrified of rejection. It attacks you because it believes attack is safety. It learned this somewhere. It learned that being harsh protects you from disappointment. It learned that punishing you might keep you from being punished by others. It learned that perfection was the only safe path. And now it uses these outdated survival strategies even when they hurt you more than they help you. Understanding this is not an excuse. It is insight. And insight allows compassion to rise. Compassion toward the critic begins with recognizing its origin. Some critics were shaped by strict parents, some by fear of abandonment, some by cultural pressure, some by trauma, some by environments that required you to be vigilant to avoid harm. The critic is the part of you that took on the role of protector when no one else could fill it. It tried to keep you safe by pushing you, shaming you, or frightening you. But it never learned another way. When you see this clearly, the critic becomes less intimidating. It becomes smaller, more vulnerable, more human. You stop hearing a monster and start hearing a frightened part of your psyche that has been running on outdated programming for years. This is where compassion becomes a tool of liberation. Compassion toward the critic does not mean agreeing with it. It does not mean feeding it. It means saying, "I see you. I know you are scared. I know you are trying to protect me, but I don't need protection through pain anymore." Speaking to the critic this way is like speaking to a frightened child who uses anger to hide fear. You offer steadiness instead of resistance. You offer presence instead of panic. This approach begins to soften the critic's grip. It lessens the intensity of its attacks. Because the critic is not fueled by your mistakes, it is fueled by fear. When fear meets compassion, it begins to dissolve. The inner critic also loses strength when you recognize that it is not your true voice. It is a fragment, a splinter, a survival adaptation. When it speaks, instead of believing it fully, you can say inwardly, "This is the critic speaking, not the whole of me." This separation is powerful. It prevents the critic from merging with your identity. It becomes one part of you rather than the defining voice. Meeting the critic with compassion also means letting it express its fears without letting them control you. Sometimes you can sit quietly and say inwardly, "Tell me what you are afraid of." The critic might respond, not in words, but in sensations, in tension, in a feeling of dread. When you sit with those sensations without judgment, the critic feels seen. This seeing begins to heal it. The critic softens further when you learn to respond with warmth. When it says, "You're failing," you can say, "I hear your fear. I'm still here." When it says, "You're not enough," you can respond, "You learned to say that to protect me. You don't have to guard me that way anymore." When it says, "You will embarrass yourself," you can say, "Thank you for caring. Let me try my way now." These responses seem simple, but they reach the critic in a way arguments never could. The critic is built from pain, so it only understands being met with openness. Another aspect of compassion toward the critic is curiosity. Instead of shutting it down, you can explore it gently. Where did you learn this tone? What are you trying to prevent? What are you afraid will happen if you stop? This kind of curiosity is not interrogation. It is tenderness. It helps you uncover buried beliefs that have been directing your behavior for years. When these beliefs are seen clearly, they lose their grip. They cannot control you from the shadows anymore. Compassion also allows you to update the critic's role. Instead of trying to kill it, you invite it to evolve. You teach it a new language. Instead of punishment, encouragement. Instead of fear, patience. Instead of threats, reassurance. You might say inwardly, "You want to keep me safe. Let's learn a different way." Over time, the critic becomes less of a judge and more of a cautious advisor, still protective, but not harmful. Practicing compassion for the critic is also essential because the critic often represents internalized relationships. If you grew up with harshness, the critic reflects it. If you grew up with unpredictability, the critic mirrors it. When you respond to this part of you with compassion, you are not just healing the critic. You are healing the original wound it came from. You are offering the love that was missing. You are rewriting emotional memory. Compassion toward the critic also stops cycles of self-punishment. Many people respond to their critic with self-hatred. Why am I like this? Why do I always judge myself? This creates a second critic attacking the first. Compassion ends this cycle by saying, both of these voices are hurting, both need kindness. This dissolves inner conflict and brings harmony. Another layer of this practice is recognizing that the critic often shows up strongest when you are vulnerable. Stress, exhaustion, uncertainty, grief, these open the door. The critic appears not because you're failing, but because you're fragile. When you meet vulnerability with compassion instead of hostility, you stop turning vulnerability into suffering. Compassion also helps you reclaim your power. When you fight the critic, you give it energy. When you fear it, you give it authority. When you meet it with kindness, you take your power back. Because kindness is strength. It is clarity. It is stability. It is the ability to stay with yourself in moments when the critic wants you to abandon yourself. Another profound effect of compassion is that the critic becomes less reactive over time. When it appears and you respond with warmth, it begins to trust you, it begins to relax, it begins to believe that you can handle life without its old methods. This internal trust is the beginning of deep healing. Over time, compassion transforms the critic into something new. It becomes an inner reminder to be careful, not cruel. It becomes a quiet guardian instead of a punisher. It becomes a whisper instead of a scream. It becomes a part of you that finally feels safe. This healing does not happen overnight. It unfolds gently, like thawing ice. But every moment of compassion matters. Every kind response reshapes the critic's structure. Every soft word builds a new pattern. You are not destroying the critic, you are guiding it home. And slowly, a moment will come when you hear the critic speak with less force, less threat, less injury. And in that moment, you will feel something shift. Not because the critic disappeared, but because the part of you that meets it has grown into a presence so stable and loving that nothing inside you needs to be feared. When you start meeting your inner critic with kindness instead of fear, something shifts in a very quiet way. The attacks lose some of their sharpness. The voice sounds less like a judge and more like a frightened echo from the past. And then a deeper question rises. If this part of you can speak so loudly and yet still not be the whole of you, what else inside your mind has been mistaken for you? That's where a new layer of freedom begins. The moment you realize that thoughts are not the same as self, chains you never knew were there start to loosen. There is a strange relief when you hear a cruel thought pass through your mind, and instead of agreeing with it or fighting it, you simply say, "This is a thought, not a fact, not a prophecy, not an order, just mental weather moving through awareness." The sentence, "This is a thought, not myself," sounds simple, almost too simple, but it holds a key that Buddhist practice has been pointing to for centuries. The mind produces content. You are not that content. The more clearly you see this, the weaker self-directed negativity becomes. Most people grow up believing that whatever appears in their mind belongs to them. If a harsh sentence arises, they think, "I am harsh." If jealousy rises, they think, "I am jealous." If fear shows up, they think, "I am fearful." The thought and the thinker fuse into one lump. And when that happens, every ugly or confused mental event feels like a verdict about who you are. This fusion gives negative thoughts enormous power. A single inner insult doesn't just hurt, it seems to define you. The practice of observing thought without ownership begins with separating event from identity. A thought appears, that is all. You don't have to sign your name under it. You don't have to stamp it as your truth. You don't have to take responsibility for its existence in the same way you don't take responsibility for clouds passing through the sky. The sky doesn't apologize for storms. It simply allows them, then clears. Your mind can learn to do the same. This doesn't mean abandoning responsibility for your actions. Behavior still matters. Choices still matter. But thoughts are not the same as choices. They are possibilities, impulses, fragments of memory, conditioning, habit. Many of them pass through without being acted on. When you start to see thoughts as momentary events, you realize you are more than the worst sentence your mind can generate about you. One powerful way to practice this is by changing the language you use internally. Instead of saying, "I am a failure," you can notice, "There is a thought about failure." Instead of, I am worthless, you can say, the mind is producing a thought about worthlessness. Instead of, I hate myself, you can notice, a painful thought of self-hatred has arisen. This shift may feel subtle, but it creates space. The I steps back. The thought is no longer fused with identity. It becomes something you can hold in awareness instead of drowning in. This space is where compassion enters. When you stop saying, I am this, and begin saying, this is here, you give yourself room to respond. A thought that used to hit you like a punch becomes an object you can examine gently. You might feel its impact, but you also see its nature. You notice its tone, its pattern, its frequency. Over time, you begin recognizing recurring thought forms: the fearful one, the perfectionist one, the hopeless one. They stop feeling like your essence and start feeling like old habits passing through. Buddhist practice often uses the metaphor of watching a river. Thoughts are like leaves floating by on the surface. You don't need to chase each one, analyze where it came from, or decide if it belongs to you. You simply notice it, acknowledge it, and let it pass. The trouble begins when you grab a leaf and clutch it to your chest, declaring, "This is who I am." Disidentifying from thought is like letting the leaf keep moving. Negative self-talk loses power when it is seen clearly. The critic might say, "You ruin everything." When believed, this sentence sinks into your chest, fills your body with shame, and shapes your behavior. But if you respond with, "There is a critical thought present," the spell breaks a little. It's still uncomfortable, but it is no longer unquestionable truth. You've moved from being inside the thought to watching it from outside. This outside is not dissociation. It is awareness. Dissociation numbs. Awareness feels. When you observe a harsh thought, you may still feel hurt. But now there is a part of you that sees the hurt and knows this is happening in the mind. It is not the whole of me. That witnessing part is stable. It doesn't depend on whether the thought is pleasant or unpleasant. It is simply aware. The more time you spend resting as that awareness, the less grip negative thoughts have over your identity. Another way to explore this is to notice how quickly thoughts change. One moment your mind says, "I can do this." A few hours later, it says, "I will fail." Earlier in the day, you feel confident. Later, you feel insecure. If you were identical to your thoughts, you would be changing personalities dozens of times a day. Yet something in you remains the same. That something is the awareness that notices all these shifts. Seeing this makes it harder to treat any single thought as a final judgment about who you are. Disidentification from thought also weakens fear. Many fears are made of predicted stories. This will go wrong. That person will leave. I will embarrass myself. When you forget that these are thoughts, you live inside them as if they are already real. Your body reacts as though the feared event has happened. Observing thought without ownership allows you to say, "A fear story is arising." You're not denying it. You're labeling it accurately. Fear becomes a process your mind is running, not a prison you are trapped in. This clarity is especially important with thoughts about self-worth. Statements like, "I don't matter," "No one cares," "I'm broken," can feel overwhelmingly real. They might be linked to old experiences of neglect, rejection, or trauma. Disidentifying from these thoughts doesn't erase the pain behind them, but it keeps you from reinforcing them as ultimate truths. You can acknowledge a painful belief is passing through. It is connected to past hurt. It is not the final word on me. That distinction keeps the door open for healing and new experiences. Observing thought without ownership also supports inner responsibility in a healthier way. Instead of merging with every thought and acting from it automatically, you gain the ability to choose. A thought arises. Say something cruel. You notice it. You recognize it as a thought, not an instruction. You decide not to speak from it. Another thought arises. Give up. There is no point. You see it. You acknowledge its heaviness. You choose to stay with yourself instead. In this way, you become less reactive and more deliberate. This practice can be strengthened by using very simple mental notes. When a harsh thought appears, you can label it softly, judging. When a fearful image appears, worrying. When a self-blaming memory resurfaces, remembering. These labels are not for analysis. They are for separation. They remind you that you are the one who knows, not the content that is known. Over time, this way of relating to thought changes the feeling of your mind. Instead of being grabbed by every passing story, you start to feel more grounded. Thoughts still come. Some are kind, some are neutral, some are painful, but they no longer define your reality so quickly. There is a pause. And in that pause, the possibility of compassion and wise choice appears. Disidentifying from thought also helps you recognize how much of your inner negativity is learned rather than true. When you watch thoughts as objects, you start to notice which ones carry familiar tones from your past. Maybe a line sounds like something a parent used to say. Maybe it echoes a teacher's criticism. Maybe it reflects cultural messages about worth and success. Seeing these as learned patterns, not your essence, makes it easier to release them. You're not betraying yourself by letting them go. You're shedding borrowed voices. Another important aspect of this practice is realizing that not all thoughts need fixing. Some simply arise and fade. If you jump in to fix every negative thought, you give them more energy. Watching them without ownership allows the mind's natural self-clearing ability to operate. Just as the body can heal a cut when you stop picking at it, the mind can let go of many painful thoughts when you stop feeding them with identification. At first, this can feel strange. You may think, if I don't fight these thoughts, aren't I agreeing with them? But observing is not agreement. It is simply clarity. If anything, identification is closer to agreement than observation is. When you believe a thought completely, you become it. When you observe it, you step back. You see, this is here, and I can choose how to respond. This practice also transforms meditation from a battle to a relationship. Many people think meditation means stopping thoughts. They sit, thoughts appear, and they feel like they've failed. But the purpose is not to stop thought. It is to change your relationship with thought. When you sit and watch thoughts arise and pass without ownership, you are practicing freedom. Whether the mind is noisy or quiet, you are free when you know you are not the noise. Applied in daily life, this skill protects you during moments of stress. A flash of self-hatred might spike up after a mistake. Before, you might have believed it immediately and spiraled. Now, you can feel it sting and still think, that was a thought. You breathe, you let it pass. you choose a different, kinder sentence to guide your next step. You do not have to pretend the harsh thought never arose. You simply refuse to build your identity around it. Over time, the repetition of, "This is a thought, not myself," becomes a kind of inner mantra, not to escape reality, but to come closer to it. Reality is not your worst thought about yourself. Reality is the awareness that sees that thought, feels its impact, and still holds you gently through it. The more you rest as that awareness, the less your mind can use its old tricks to hurt you. And slowly, what used to feel like an internal prison begins to feel more like an open space. Thoughts come and go, feelings rise and fall, stories appear and fade. Through all of it, there is a steady presence that does not abandon you. The more you trust that presence, the less you need to believe every painful sentence your mind creates. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who sees them, and that realization, lived again and again, is what finally weakens the power of self-directed negativity and allows a gentler, truer way of being with yourself to grow. When you learn to see your thoughts as events instead of identity, a new clarity begins to form around something that has quietly fueled your suffering for years. The distance between who you are and who you think you should be. That silent tension, that internal pulling, the constant sense of not enough yet. It tightens the chest, drains motivation, and creates a pressure that never seems to lift. And once you notice it, you start to see how many layers of your self-talk have been built around chasing an ideal version of yourself that doesn't actually exist. This is where the path turns again, toward closing the painful gap between the real you and the imaginary you your mind has been punishing you for not becoming. There is a moment when you realize that most of your self-judgment comes not from your actions, but from your expectations. The mind builds an image of who you should be: calmer, stronger, more confident, more productive, more disciplined, more successful, more enlightened. And everything you do is measured against this invisible figure. But the more you chase this ideal self, the further away you feel. No amount of achievement satisfies it, because the ideal shifts every time you grow. It's a moving target, a phantom, a mirage your mind uses to justify endless pressure. Buddhist realism cuts through this illusion by reminding you that life unfolds through causes and conditions, not through imaginary standards. You cannot be someone different from who you are without first understanding who you are. You cannot jump to a future state without honoring the present state that leads to it. When you hold yourself to unrealistic expectations, you treat yourself as if you are independent from conditions, as if you should magically be wiser, stronger, calmer, or more skillful than your past prepared you to be. Compassionate self-talk helps dissolve this illusion, allowing you to meet yourself with honesty instead of pressure. The first step is recognizing the pain of the ideal. When you say, "I should be more confident," the sentence carries the weight of self-rejection. When you say, "I should be over this by now," the sentence denies your own humanity. When you say, "I should not struggle with this," you ignore the causes and conditions that shaped your experience. This should voice does not inspire growth, it suffocates it, because growth requires acceptance of the starting point. You cannot move forward while rejecting the ground beneath your feet. To close the gap, your self-talk must shift from demanding transformation to supporting transformation. Instead of saying, "I should be calm," you can say, I'm learning how to stay steady. Instead of, I should not feel this way, you say, this feeling is here and I can work with it. Instead of, I should be better, you say, I'm growing at the pace my life allows. These sentences do not dilute responsibility. They make responsibility realistic. They acknowledge the truth of your present conditions, and truth is the soil where real progress grows. Another part of closing this gap is seeing how the ideal self is built. It is often stitched together from pieces of other people's expectations, pieces of culture, pieces of childhood, pieces of comparison. Rarely is the ideal self something you consciously chose. It is something you absorbed, and yet you measure yourself against it daily. When you speak to yourself from this place, you reinforce a burden you never agreed to carry. Self-talk rooted in Buddhist realism helps you drop this burden. Instead of saying, I should be further along, you can say, this is where my path is right now. Instead of saying, I should be like them, you say, their path has different conditions. Instead of saying, I should not have these flaws, you say, flaws are part of development. When your self-talk acknowledges the causes that shaped you, the unrealistic expectations begin to lose their grip. Another layer of this practice is seeing how the ideal self creates shame. Shame arises when you feel like you are failing to become someone you think you must be. But Buddhism teaches that suffering comes from clinging to the past, clinging to identity, clinging to what you think should exist. The ideal self is a form of clinging. When you let it go, shame starts to dissolve. Your self-talk becomes less about meeting a standard and more about meeting yourself. Self-talk grounded in realism also honors effort. The ideal self demands perfection. Realistic self-talk notices your intention. It notices the small attempts. It notices the slow improvements. It notices the moments you tried even when it was hard. When you say to yourself, I'm doing my best, you are not lowering the bar. You are seeing the bar clearly. You are recognizing that effort must match capacity, not fantasy. And when effort is acknowledged, motivation grows naturally. Closing the gap also requires seeing that growth is uneven. The ideal self imagines growth as a straight line. Real growth moves in waves. Some days you feel clear. Some days you feel lost. Some days you break old patterns. Some days old patterns return. The ideal self sees setbacks as failure. Realistic self-talk sees setbacks as part of the process. When you say, today is harder, but this is part of change, you remove the judgment that makes setbacks heavier. This keeps you from spiraling into self-blame. Another important part is recognizing that unrealistic expectations often come from misunderstanding what progress looks like. Progress is rarely dramatic. It often shows up as smaller reactions, shorter spirals, softer self-talk, quicker recovery. The ideal self ignores these shifts because they don't look big enough. Realistic self-talk celebrates them. When you say, I responded more gently than before, you reinforce growth you might otherwise overlook. Buddhist realism also teaches that you cannot be anything other than what present causes allow. This is not fatalism, it is wisdom. If your nervous system is overwhelmed, you cannot be calm. If your mind is tired, you cannot be perfectly focused. If your emotions are wounded, you cannot be flawlessly compassionate. Self-talk grounded in this understanding gently reminds you I cannot skip steps. Healing and growth take time. This perspective naturally reduces self-judgment, because judgment thrives on the belief that you should be different than your conditions allow. Once you see this as unrealistic, the judgment loses its force. You stop asking the impossible of yourself. Closing the gap also means seeing how much of your suffering comes from internal comparisons. You compare the real you to a fantasy you. The fantasy always wins. Realistic self-talk dissolves this habit by shifting the focus to the present moment. What can I do right now with the tools I have? This question replaces the painful comparison with practical compassion. Another part of closing the gap is speaking to yourself with encouragement instead of pressure. Encouragement is active. It helps you move forward. Pressure is heavy. It paralyzes you. When you say, "Keep going one small step," your body relaxes. When you say, "Why aren't you there yet?" your body tightens. Encouragement opens the path. Pressure blocks it. Realistic self-talk also helps dissolve the illusion of the perfect self. The ideal version of you would never feel insecure, never feel afraid, never feel uncertain. But Buddhism teaches that even enlightened beings experience emotion. The difference is awareness, not elimination. When you remind yourself, "Emotions don't make me flawed," you close the gap between your humanity and your expectations. Another crucial layer is acknowledging that the should-be voice often carries the echo of external judgment. It might sound like a parent who demanded success, a teacher who expected perfection, a society that values constant achievement. When you speak realistically to yourself, you begin separating your own voice from these inherited ones. You begin reclaiming your inner world. Closing the gap also requires speaking to yourself in a way that matches your current life, not an imagined future life. Telling yourself you should meditate an hour a day when you're overwhelmed only sets you up to fail. Realistic self-talk says, "What is manageable for me today?" This flexibility prevents burnout and builds consistency. Another layer of realistic self-talk is acknowledging your needs without guilt. The ideal self thinks needs are weaknesses. Realistic self-talk understands that needs are part of being alive. When you say, "I need rest," instead of "I shouldn't be tired," you treat yourself with compassion instead of denial. Realistic self-talk also helps you dismantle the idea that you must earn your own kindness. The ideal self says, "I'll be kind to myself when I meet my standards." Realistic self-talk says, "I need kindness now so I can grow." This reverses the harmful cycle that keeps you chasing approval inside your own mind. Another powerful part of this practice is recognizing that the you who wants to grow and the you who struggles are not enemies. They are both trying to move you forward. One tries through vision, the other tries through survival. Realistic self-talk unites them by acknowledging both your longing and your limitations. This balanced dialogue might sound like, "I want to become that version of myself someday, and right now, I'm growing slowly." Both are true. When both truths are held, the internal conflict quiets. You stop fighting yourself. Eventually, as you practice self-talk rooted in Buddhist realism, the gap between who you are and who you should be begins to shrink, not because you forced yourself into an ideal, but because you stopped pushing yourself away. You stopped attacking yourself for not being a fantasy. You started walking with yourself instead of chasing yourself. And in that companionship, real growth becomes possible. When you begin closing the painful distance between who you are and who you think you should be, a new kind of clarity forms in the background. You start noticing how much pressure you've carried, how much of your suffering came from impossible standards, how much peace grows when you finally allow yourself to be human. And right when this softness begins to take root, something subtle can sneak in, a quiet shift where the mind begins using self-improvement, not as a path to kindness, but as a new way to strengthen the ego. The harsh voice softens, but another voice rises, dressed in positivity, wisdom, and even spirituality. It speaks not to heal you, but to elevate you above others, or to make you feel superior to your old self. This is the subtle trap. When positive self-talk becomes ego's new mask, a form of spiritual materialism disguised as growth. There is a delicate point where self-talk shifts from compassion to inflation. At first, you use kind words to support yourself through challenges, but eventually the mind may begin using those same words to create a new identity, an identity that sounds peaceful but is actually attached to being special, enlightened, wise, or above the struggles you used to face. This shift is so quiet, most people don't notice it. It feels empowering at first, but it secretly creates tension. Because every time you slip, every time you feel human, every time an old pattern returns, the inflated identity cracks, and the mind responds by rebuilding it, stronger, more polished, more spiritual, instead of dissolving the need for identity altogether. Self-talk becomes ego-driven when it moves from "I am growing" to "I must prove I am growing." When your inner voice starts creating narratives like "I'm wiser than others," "I'm more awakened," "I don't struggle like ordinary people," or "I am above these emotions," the tone shifts from compassion to comparison. This is not growth. It is ego hiding behind spiritual language. The ego's favorite trick is to use whatever you give it. If you feed yourself shame, it will build an identity around being broken. If you feed yourself harshness, it will build an identity around being not enough. And if you feed yourself spiritual phrases without awareness, it will build an identity around being superior. This is why Buddhist teachings always warn against spiritual materialism, the habit of turning the path itself into something you possess. It is like using wisdom to polish a mirror you still believe is you. Positive self-talk becomes harmful when it becomes a measurement. When you start thinking you're only valuable if you stay positive, only spiritually advanced if you never react, only worthy if you never feel jealousy, anger, or insecurity. These expectations are simply the old perfectionism wearing a new robe. They recreate suffering while pretending to remove it. True compassion doesn't place you above anyone, not even the version of yourself who still struggles. True compassion does not need superiority. It does not need titles like evolved or awakened. It needs honesty. It needs humility. It needs sincerity. When you speak to yourself from compassion, the words feel freeing. When you speak to yourself from ego, the words feel heavy, even if they sound beautiful. One of the clearest signs that positive self-talk has become ego-driven is when you use it to avoid your real feelings. Instead of acknowledging sadness, you jump to, "I'm grateful for everything." Instead of acknowledging fear, you say, "Everything is perfect as it is." Instead of acknowledging anger, you say, "I'm too evolved to be upset." These phrases may sound wise, but they create distance between you and your own emotions. This is not spiritual growth. It is emotional avoidance. Buddhist realism teaches you to see things as they are, not as your ego wants them to be. Another sign is when you begin comparing your growth to others. The ego loves comparison because comparison maintains identity. The moment you think, "I handle things better than them," or "I am more mindful than these people," or "my self-talk is healthier than theirs," the ego inflates. The path becomes a competition instead of a liberation. Compassion collapses into judgment, and the inner peace you built becomes fragile, dependent on staying better than others. This fragility is the biggest danger of ego-driven self-talk. Because the moment life tests you, the identity you built begins to shake. If you use positive self-talk as a performance, every moment of fear feels like failure. Every moment of doubt feels like regression. Every moment of anger feels like you betrayed your own growth. The self becomes divided. The spiritual self who wants to appear calm, and the real self who is still learning, still feeling, still human. This division creates internal conflict far worse than the one you started with. To avoid this trap, self-talk must stay rooted in truth. Truth means you acknowledge your emotions. Truth means you accept your limits. Truth means you admit when you're overwhelmed. Truth means you meet yourself where you are instead of forcing yourself into an image of who you think you should be. Positive self-talk that denies reality is not positivity. It is self-deception. Another subtle trap is using spiritual language to suppress discomfort. Saying things like, "Everything happens for a reason," "I should just let go," "I have to stay detached," when what you actually need is to feel, grieve, or rest. When self-talk tries to bypass the emotional process, it becomes violence disguised as wisdom. The middle way is not about escaping experience. It is about meeting experience without clinging or fear. To prevent positive self-talk from becoming spiritual materialism, you must stay connected to humility. Humility doesn't mean shrinking. It means remembering that you are learning just like everyone else. It means seeing your growth as part of a long path, not a badge of honor. It means knowing you are not above your own humanity. When humility guides your self-talk, every sentence becomes honest. I am growing, and I still struggle. I have learned, and I still make mistakes. I can choose kindness, and sometimes I forget. This honesty protects you from ego inflation because it removes the illusion of perfection. You stop trying to be a flawless version of yourself. You become more available to the truth of the present moment. Another key is practicing grounded positivity. Grounded positivity doesn't deny challenges. It doesn't exaggerate strengths. It doesn't force optimism. It simply offers support. It says things like, "This is hard, and I'm doing my best. I'm hurting, but I'm not alone. I can grow from here without rushing." This positivity strengthens resilience without creating superiority. It is also important to remember that compassion never divides. Ego divides constantly. Ego says, "I am different. I am better. I am beyond this." Compassion says, "I am human. I am connected. I am learning with everyone else." When your self-talk unites you with others instead of separating you, you know it is coming from sincerity, not ego. Another way to avoid the trap is to focus your self-talk on process rather than identity. Identity statements like "I am wise" or "I am awakened" lock you into rigid standards. Process statements like "I am practicing," "I am learning to stay present," "I am working on compassion" keep you flexible, grounded, and open. It is also essential to examine your motivation. Are you speaking kindly to yourself because you want to care for your suffering, or because you want to maintain an image of being calm, spiritual, or enlightened? Compassion aims to reduce suffering. Ego aims to increase status, internal or external. Your body can help you tell the difference. Ego-driven positivity creates tension. It feels tight, pressured, hollow, performative. Compassion-driven positivity feels warm, spacious, steady. It softens the breath. It calms the chest. It feels true. A powerful question to ask yourself is, would I speak this way if no one could see my growth? If the answer is yes, your self-talk is sincere. If the answer is no, the ego may be involved. Finally, the deepest protection against this trap is remembering the purpose of the path itself. The purpose is not to become special, not to become impressive, not to become extraordinary. The purpose is freedom from suffering, from clinging, from fear, from illusion. When your self-talk leads you toward freedom, it is healthy. When it leads you toward identity, it becomes another cage. True compassion doesn't make you bigger or smaller, it makes you real. It makes your inner world honest, soft, and grounded. It lets you grow without creating a self to worship. It lets you evolve without needing to perform your evolution. When you begin to see how easily the ego can hide inside even the softest words, something in you relaxes in a very different way. You stop trying to hold a perfect inner posture. You stop performing kindness. You stop using spiritual language to control yourself. And in that release, something more truthful becomes visible. Your inner world is not a fixed structure. It's not a solid personality. It's not a single voice or identity. It's a moving stream, a shifting, living flow of sensations, moods, memories, impulses, hopes, fears, and quiet intuitions. None of it stays. None of it repeats in the exact same way. And now the practice deepens again, because self-talk that truly heals cannot be rigid. It must move with you. It must adapt to the changing currents of your inner life moment by moment. There is a softness that develops when you stop expecting yourself to be consistent in the ways ego demands. Maybe yesterday you felt confident. Today you feel uncertain. Maybe 1 hour you feel peaceful. The next hour you feel overwhelmed. Maybe a memory rises suddenly and changes your mood. Maybe your body feels different than it did earlier. The mind is a river. The self is not a stone. When you speak to yourself as if you are supposed to stay the same, you suffer. But when you speak to yourself as if you are a stream, shifting naturally, changing with conditions, you begin to feel aligned with the truth of your own nature. Loving self-talk becomes alive when it responds to the present version of you instead of forcing a tone meant for yesterday's version. The version of you who is tired needs different words than the version of you who is energized. The version of you who is grieving needs different words than the version who feels steady. The version of you who feels anxious needs different support than the version who feels strong. When you begin to recognize these fluctuations, your self-talk becomes a companion instead of a judge. One of the most important parts of this practice is noticing the micro shifts inside you. the small waves, noticing when the breath tightens, noticing when the heart slows, noticing when irritation rises, noticing when sadness softens, noticing when the mind becomes cloudy. These shifts are signals. The body speaks before the mind does. When you catch these early movements, you can adjust your inner tone gently without waiting for a storm to form. Sometimes you need encouragement. I know this is hard, but stay with me. Sometimes you need calmness. Slow down, you don't have to rush. Sometimes you need grounding. Let's take one breath together. Sometimes you need permission. It's okay to feel like this. Sometimes you need direction. One small step is enough right now. Sometimes you need softness. You're hurting. I'm here. Sometimes you need clarity. This thought is not the whole truth. The skill is not memorizing the phrases. The skill is sensing which tone fits the current state of your mind. The more awareness you bring to the present moment, the easier this becomes. You begin to sense what the mind needs the way a caring parent senses what a child needs. Not out of obligation, not out of force, but out of attunement. Attunement is the heart of loving self-talk. It is the ability to feel where you are right now and respond with kindness instead of habit. To speak to yourself as a continuously changing stream of consciousness, you must drop the idea that there is a single correct way to talk to yourself. Some days, compassion feels nourishing. Other days, it feels too tender, and you need grounding instead. Some days, positivity feels supportive. Other days, it feels dishonest, and what you really need is honesty. This hurts, and it's okay to admit that. Loving self-talk adapts. It doesn't impose. A rigid script of kindness becomes useless if it doesn't meet the reality of your state. If you feel exhausted and your self-talk says, "You're doing great, stay positive," you may feel disconnected. But if it says, "You're tired, let's move slowly," something in you unclenches. You feel met instead of managed. Loving self-talk is the art of saying to yourself what truth and compassion would say in this exact moment. Not what a spiritual book says, not what a motivational quote says, not what yesterday's you needed, but what right now asks for. This practice also helps dissolve internal resistance. Resistance arises when your inner state and your self-talk don't match. If you're overwhelmed and your self-talk demands productivity, resistance grows. If you're sad and your self-talk demands positivity, resistance grows. If you're scared and your self-talk demands bravery, resistance grows. But if your words match your state, gently, honestly, resistance lowers. The inner world opens. Healing happens faster because nothing inside you is being denied. Speaking to yourself as a changing stream also teaches you humility. You realize you cannot control your inner world with force. You cannot force yourself to feel confident. You cannot force yourself to be peaceful. You cannot force fear out of your body. But you can accompany yourself through each shift. You can stay present. You can respond to yourself skillfully. This companionship is far more powerful than inner dominance. Another important aspect of this practice is recognizing that your consciousness is influenced by many causes: sleep, food, hormones, memories, weather, social interaction, unresolved emotions, physical tension, past experiences, and the simple unpredictability of being human. When you speak to yourself as if you are supposed to rise above all these conditions, you create suffering. When you speak to yourself with the understanding that conditions shape your inner life moment by moment, compassion becomes natural. Instead of, "Why am I like this today?" you say, "Something in me needs care today." Instead of, "I was fine yesterday, why not now?" you say, "Today has its own conditions." Instead of, "I shouldn't feel this way," you say, "This feeling belongs to this moment." This shift reduces self-blame because you stop treating the inner world as a personal flaw. You start seeing it as a flowing process. This flowing nature also means you can let go of stories quickly. If anger rises, you don't need to build an identity around it. If sadness appears, you don't need to fear its permanence. If insecurity surfaces, you don't need to make it mean something about your worth. You simply adapt your inner voice to meet the moment. This is here now, and it will change. Speaking to yourself as a stream also prevents attachment to positive states. Many people cling tightly to moments of confidence or peace. When those states fade, they panic. They think something is wrong. But when you view consciousness as a river, you stop clinging. You can enjoy the peaceful moments without expecting them to remain. And when difficult moments come, you can meet them with steadiness, knowing they won't stay either. One of the deepest benefits of this practice is learning emotional fluidity. You stop freezing your emotions into rigid categories like good or bad. Instead, you allow them to move, and your self-talk moves with them. You stop fighting yourself for shifting. You stop criticizing yourself for changing. You stop expecting consistency that isn't realistic. This inner flexibility softens everything. It makes mistakes easier to recover from. It makes fear less frightening. It makes sadness less heavy. Because you know each state is just passing through, and you know how to meet each one with the right kind of care. Eventually, your self-talk becomes less like instructions and more like companionship. Less like commands and more like guidance. Less like judgment and more like presence. You begin to feel supported, not controlled. You begin to feel held, not monitored. You begin to feel understood by your own mind. And when you reach this way of relating to yourself, you discover something profound. The mind becomes a safe place. Not because it is always calm, but because whatever it becomes, you know how to meet it. You've walked through every layer of your inner world. You've seen how thoughts become seeds, how harshness becomes suffering, how kindness becomes strength. You've learned to soften the second arrow, to build an inner sangha, to speak with metta, to listen before words form, to see the critic as a hurting part of you, to step back from thoughts that once felt like truth, to drop impossible expectations, to avoid ego traps, and to meet yourself as a living, changing stream instead of a fixed identity. And now you know something most people go their whole lives without realizing. You never needed to be perfect to deserve kindness. You never needed to be special to deserve compassion. You never needed to earn your own love. You only needed to turn toward yourself with the same gentleness you've offered to others. That's the heart of this teaching, the core of every chapter. The truth beneath every practice. Speak to yourself the way you'd speak to someone you love, because you are someone you love, or at least you can be, starting now. If these lessons touched something inside you, if even one sentence made your mind soften or your breath loosen, then I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and write, "I choose kindness, not for me, for you," as a promise to your future self. And if you want more teachings like this, more wisdom, more calm, more strength for your journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This path doesn't end here. We keep growing together. Until next time, be gentle with your mind. It's listening.